The first time I saw the book, it lay on a forgotten shelf in the infirmary library, spine cracked, corners chewed by damp and time. The candlelight was low and yellow. The snow outside Cedwyn's walls was still falling in slow, stubborn flakes, as if winter refused to move on. I should have been grinding herbs, measuring tinctures, tending to the coughs and fevers of merchants and soldiers. Instead, my hand reached for that crooked volume as if it were reaching back for me. The cover showed ravens in flight above a crossroads. Their wings were only crude black strokes, yet I heard them at once, the rasping caw over a road slick with mud and gilt. The title was stamped in flaking letters that once had been gold. I knew the title. I had seen copies before, pressed into the hands of peasants and nobles, quoted from pulpits and tavern benches. It was a treatise, they said, a warning about monsters in human shape, about witches and the supposed evil in their blood. Monstrum, or a portrayal of witches. I remember how my fingers hesitated over those words. I am a physician. I believe in fevers and fractures, in lungs full of fluid and bellies knotted with hunger. Yet that book had bled more men than any plague. I had seen faces twist with fear at the sight of a medallion on a chain. I had heard whispers turn into stones in a crowd's hands. I had stitched the torn skin those stones left behind. When I opened the book that night, the pages exhaled the smell of ink and mildew, and under it all, a faint trace of smoke. Someone had carried it through fire once, perhaps through more than one. The text danced in the candlelight, full of certainty, full of pious outrage, full of lies shaped carefully enough to look like truth. Yet what drew my eye was not the invective, not the curses against mutants and sorcerers. It was a single spidery line in the margin, in a different hand, written long ago in a dry, impatient script I knew. It read only this: "You know better than this, Artemon." My pulse stumbled. The quill slipped in my grip and left a trail of ink across my own thumb. It had been years since I had heard that name spoken aloud, years since I had thought of the man who bore it, or of the witcher who wrote that little rebuke in the margin. Yet, with those 5 words, the candles, the infirmary, the winter outside my window, all fell away, as if someone had blown the dust off my memories. I was no longer an old man hunched over a desk. I was younger, my back straighter, my hands steadier. The air smelled not of tallow and medicine, but of wet soil, horse sweat, and the sour fear of a crowd. There was a gallows on the hill that day. Even now, when my joints ache and my breath is short, I can see it clearly. The sky above Cedwyn was a low pewter lid. Ravens balanced along the crossbeam as if it were built especially for them. The road up the slope had turned to sludge under too many boots. I walked it with my physician's satchel at my side, summoned to stand by in case someone survived long enough to be worth saving. It is a strange occupation, standing at the edge of a death sentence, with bandages in your hands. They brought the condemned man between 2 lines of guards. He walked without stumbling, though his wrists were bound and his white hair had been matted dark in places where blood had run. His medallion had been taken. His sword, too. Without them he looked almost ordinary, just another young man who had made some unforgivable mistake in a world that forgives so little. Almost. There was something in the way his eyes measured the crowd that did not belong to any peasant or soldier. It was a kind of weary vigilance, as if he had expected this from the moment he first drew breath. That was how I met Geralt. Though we did not yet speak, around us voices rose like the buzzing of flies. "Witcher," they murmured, "monster, cursed." Some shouted that he had drawn steel on honest men. Others claimed he had meddled in things that did not concern him. It always interests me how people remember only half the story. No one on that hill was eager to repeat the part about the girl he had pulled from a ditch, or the men who had dragged her there in the first place. No one spoke of the blood already on their own hands. If you listen to the book in my hands, to Monstrum, the lesson is simple. Witches are abominations. They bring misfortune. They are fit only for the rope and the stake. It says so in long, clever sentences that sound almost like scripture. Yet even then, standing in the cold with my satchel, I remember thinking that the world looked more complicated than ink on a page. The peasants who threw stones had their reasons. The magistrate who signed the order had his. The witcher on the hill had his. And I, who did nothing but watch, had mine as well. That is what age gives you, if you are unlucky enough to reach it. The knowledge that everyone has reasons, and that reasons are not the same as excuses. It is the same in a sick room. One man drinks himself into liver rot to forget the war. Another hoards bread until his children's bellies swell with hunger, convinced the next famine is already on its way. You learn to pry gently at their choices without judging too quickly, because judgment never set a bone or cleared a lung. Yet even so, there are days when the weight of all those explanations sits heavier on the chest than any illness. That night in the infirmary, with the ravens staring up at me from the cover, I could have put the book back. I could have blown out the candle and let the past stay where it was buried. I had patience waiting, and my hands were already stained with new lives I might save or fail. But something in that dry, familiar script would not let me. You know better than this, Artemon. The words might as well have been addressed to me. Did I know better? Did I, who had seen those events with my own eyes, have the right to remain silent while ink and fear told the story in my place? So I will not stay silent. If you are willing, sit with me a while longer. Imagine the snow thick on your cloak, the smell of smoke in your nostrils, the sound of ravens shifting their claws on seasoned wood. Imagine a young witcher on a hill, punished not for the lives he took, but for the one life he tried to save. Imagine an old physician at the foot of the scaffold, clutching bandages he will never be asked to use, already wondering what this moment will cost the boy in the years to come. Stories often begin at Crossroads. This one begins under the watchful eyes of birds that feast on whatever we leave hanging. Men wrote a book to explain creatures like Geralt, to name them monster, and feel safer for doing so. I open that book now because I was there before the ink dried. I saw what it chose to omit. And yet, we cannot help but wonder whether the real monstrosity lies in the flesh we fear, or in the words we trust too easily. The gallows at Rockamora had been built in a hurry. I can always tell when wood has not been given time to settle. It creaks differently. It does not protest the weight so much as complain about the haste of men. That day, as I climbed the slope, with my satchel biting into my shoulder, the whole structure gave off that impatient sound, as if even the timber wanted this to be over quickly. Rocamora was not a grand town. Its streets were half mud, half stone, the houses low and leaning toward one another like old gossips. The only reason to build such a gallows there was the road that cut across its heart, the same road that led to Caedwen and beyond. A spectacle on that hill would be seen by merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and wandering fools like me. Word would travel. Someone had decided that a lesson was required, and lessons are always more effective when the audience is large. I took my place just beyond the ring of guards. They knew me. A physician is useful even when the sentence is death. There are always mishaps. Ropes slip. Necks do not break cleanly. Hearts decide that this is the moment to give up, as if eager to cheat the hangman. Today, though, there was a peculiar tension in the air, as if no one expected the usual untidy struggle. The magistrate smoothed his sleeves as he mounted the platform. The priest clutched his holy symbol so tightly his knuckles shone. Then they brought the witcher out. Geralt walked between two soldiers with his wrists bound, yet he might as well have been alone. The guards flanked him in the way men flank a campfire they both need and fear. His white hair caught what little light broke through the clouds. I saw bruises along his jaw, an old scar above one brow, the faint shimmer of potion residue trapped in the lines of his skin. Witchers lend their bodies to alchemy long before they lend their swords to contracts. I had read that once in a dry treatise on mutagens. Seeing it in living flesh was quite different. The crowd surged when they saw him, as crowds always do. Some spat, some crossed themselves. A few stared in open curiosity, children craning their necks on their parents' shoulders. That is something no book ever manages to capture. Hatred does not roar on its own, it has to thread itself through daily life. One woman, cheeks flushed from the climb, held a loaf of bread under her arm and cursed Geralt with the same mouth that would later feed her family. A man who made a living repairing wagon wheels shouted for the witcher to swing, then turned to complain to his neighbour about the price of iron. Life and death were never separate affairs. A clerk read out the charges in a thin, nasal voice, practicing forbidden arts, drawing steel on honest men, spreading unrest. The words tumbled one over another with such eagerness that anyone might think the accused had single-handedly toppled a kingdom. No mention came of the girl dragged from the ditch behind the tavern. No mention of the 3 men who had cornered her there. Those details had been swallowed whole by the town overnight, even though I had seen the bruises on her throat. Her father stood at the edge of the crowd, eyes fixed on the ground. He did not shout. He did not speak. He simply held his cap in both hands and twisted the brim until it frayed. Geralt said nothing. His eyes moved once across the sea of faces. For a heartbeat, they passed over me without recognition, a stranger among strangers. I remember feeling oddly relieved. Physicians are often treated like confessors. People bring us their injuries and their secrets. It is a burden to be known too well. On that hill, I preferred to be nobody at all. The magistrate finished his speech. He spoke of order and safety, of the need to protect decent folk from unnatural beings. His words echoed passages I would later see quoted in Monstrum. though at the time I had not yet learned to recognize that cadence. It sounded persuasive, even to me, standing there with the memory of the girl's bruises still bright in my mind. That is the insidious thing about such talk. It wraps itself around a small truth until the lie at its heart is difficult to pry loose. The rope was already dangling. The ravens bounced along the beam, shifting from claw to claw. One of them dropped a feather that drifted down and caught for a moment in Geralt's hair. I wondered what he saw when he looked up. Did he see birds, or omens, or nothing at all? Witches are trained to read tracks in mud and patterns in entrails, but I have met enough of them to know that they rarely understand the workings of a frightened human crowd. Perhaps that is why we fear them. They walk through our chaos without joining it. The hangman stepped forward. The priest murmured a blessing. Someone in the back shouted for them to get on with it. I felt my fingers tighten around the strap of my satchel. You would think, after years of watching people die slowly in beds, that one more quick death would mean very little. Yet there is a difference between a body taken by illness and a body handed over deliberately to the drop. One feels like weather. The other feels like a choice. Just then, a voice cut through the noise. Enough! It was not loud, yet it carried. Heads turned. Even the ravens stilled for a moment. A man moved through the crowd with the slow certainty of someone who knew he had the right to be there. His hair was grey rather than white, but the way he held himself was the same as the witcher on the platform. Balanced. Ready. His cloak was worn, the leather at his shoulders darkened by long use. At his side hung a sword that had seen more purpose than ceremony. Preston Holt had arrived. I had treated him some years before in another village whose name the world has already forgotten. He had come to my door bleeding from a gash along his ribs, stinking of swamp water and rot. I had cleaned the wound by lamplight, listening to the frogs outside and to his silence within. Witches are economical with words. They do not waste them on groaning. The next morning he left 4 coins on my table and a 5th under the mortar, in case I found some use for it. I remembered thinking that he was the first patient who had paid me for both my work and my time. Now he climbed the steps to the platform and looked at the magistrate, at the hangman, at the priest. He did not look at Geralt at first, which told me more than any greeting would have. This was not a reunion. It was an assessment. "You intend to hang him," he said. The magistrate drew himself up. The words that followed were all about law, about precedent, about the need to make an example. I watched Holt, rather than listened to the speech. His jaw worked once, as if chewing the taste of the air. He glanced briefly at the rope, at the ravens, at the faces below. For a moment, his eyes met mine. There was no recognition in them. To him, I was just another man with a bag, another witness. Perhaps that was for the best. It is easier to speak truth when you do not feel obliged to include the healer who patched your side. Holt could have drawn his sword. Witches are capable of swift, decisive violence. Monstrum dwells on that fact with feverish delight. Yet instead he spoke of debts and contracts, of a hunt completed on behalf of Rockamora, of a promise implied, if not written. He reminded the magistrate that he had once ridden through these same streets to rid the nearby woods of a creature that had been taking livestock and children alike. The town had paid him then, and claimed him. Now they wanted to discard another of his kind like offal in a ditch. Listening to him, I felt a strange mix of admiration and discomfort. Witches are not advocates by nature. They know too well how little their words weigh against fear. Perhaps that is why Holt's voice sounded almost weary, as if he already expected to be refused and was only going through motions demanded by his own sense of order. You can call it a legal argument or an appeal to conscience. I call it something simpler. A man who has spent his life killing monsters was trying to persuade people that they themselves were capable of mercy. Whether that made him optimistic or naive, I have never quite decided. In the end, of course, no single speech moves a town. What did change was the look that passed between the magistrate and a merchant whose purse had felt the benefit of earlier contracts, between the priest and a noblewoman who remembered a child saved from a fevered nightmare by a potion brewed from strange herbs. Human memory is fickle, yet when enough small recollections tug in one direction, the great stone wheel of decision can shift. The sentence was not cancelled. That would have required courage. Instead, it was transformed. The rope was taken away. The gallows remained, empty for now, a promise lingering above the crowd. Geralt was spared the noose, yet not the punishment of exile, of being driven from Rockamora under armed escort as if he were a plague that needed to be walked to the borders. As the guards led him down from the platform, Holt watched with the silent concentration of a surgeon examining a wound. I watched them both. The crowd began to dissolve, already turning the morning into a story to be told over ale mugs. Heroes, monsters, justice. Everyone picked the word that made them feel safest. Years later, holding Monstrum in my hands, I would find a chapter that mentioned a witcher let off the noose through trickery and intimidation. The author described a scene of cowardly officials bowing before a mutant's threats. He did not mention the girl in the ditch. He did not mention the contracts honoured in blood and sweat. He certainly did not mention my vantage point at the edge of the scaffold, or the way the ravens shifted uneasily when the rope was taken down. We still cannot help wondering whether the worst lies are those shouted in anger, or the quiet omissions that leave a reader sure. He knows the whole tale. After the crowd dispersed from the gallows, Rockamora tried to pretend nothing important had happened. That is another talent towns possess. They swallow their own mornings by noon. Stalls reopened along the main street. A woman who had screamed for the witch's blood went back to haggling over salt. The priest returned to his chapel to prepare a sermon about order. Only the hill remembered, its trampled mud still printed with the shapes of boots and fear. I found Holt at the edge of the square, leaning against a water trough. The tension that had sharpened his features on the scaffold had eased, yet he did not look relaxed. Witches never quite do. Their bodies are tuned for danger in a way that ordinary men cannot fully imagine. He might have seemed idle to a passer-by, but I saw the way his gaze tracked movement, the way his fingers rested near the hilt of his sword without actually touching it. "You have aged, Master Holt," I said. He glanced at me then, a flicker of interest passing through his eyes as he placed my face among his memories. Recognition came slowly, like a reluctant guest. His mouth reshaped itself into something that might, with generosity, be called a smile. "Radko," he said, "the physician who charges too little and worries too much." I laughed at that. Laughter is a useful tool. It loosens more than just the muscles of the face. The sound seemed to surprise him as much as it did me. For a moment, the Witcher who had just manipulated a town into sparing one of his kind was gone, and in his place stood the patient who had once sat shirtless on my stool while I stitched his side, watching my hands with a kind of detached curiosity. "You chose an interesting day to visit Rockamora," I said. He shrugged. "Witchers go where contracts and trouble lead. Today they happened to point to the same place. We both knew that was only part of the truth. He had not stumbled upon the scene by chance. The timing was too precise, the arrival too well judged. I did not press, not yet. Physicians learn to let silence do a share of the work. People fill it willingly when they are ready." In the yard behind the tavern, soldiers were preparing to escort Geralt out of town. The younger Witcher stood beside a weary dun mare, his hands unbound but watched. His expression gave little away. If fear gnawed at him, it hid well behind a mask of tired attention. I noticed the way his eyes lingered on the townsfolk as they passed, not with resentment, but as if memorizing the pattern of their faces for some private ledger. "You know him," I said softly. Holt followed my gaze. His shoulders shifted, a small adjustment that said more than any sigh. "I know the path he is walking," he answered. "That is not quite the same." We shared a tankard at a corner table in the tavern. The room was dim, the beams low enough that Holt had to duck his head slightly as he sat. The air smelled of old beer and fresh onions, a universal fragrance in such places. Men around us talked of carts and weather, the rising price of grain, the rumour of skirmishes farther south. A boy darted between tables with a tray of stew and bread, and did not once glance toward the two witches outside. It is remarkable how eagerly people ignore the things they claim to fear. "You intervened on his behalf," I said, "out of solidarity or obligation." He took a slow sip before answering. "Solidarity suggests we are one brotherhood. Obligation suggests I owe him something. What I owe is to the work. A rope around his neck is a rope wasted. There are beasts yet to kill." The words were flat, almost cold, but I did not believe them entirely. Long practice has taught me to listen as much to what is not said as to what is. Witches seldom speak of their own, but the way Holt had placed himself between Geralt and the magistrate on that scaffold had not been merely economical. There had been a protectiveness in his stance that I had seen before in older soldiers standing near recruits. Those who have survived long enough in dangerous trades recognize the value of the few who might carry the work forward. "He is young," Holt added after a moment. "Young witches die quickly if left entirely to chance." Outside, the escort began to form up. Harnesses clinked, hooves stamped. The innkeeper glanced through the window with that uneasy curiosity reserved for condemned men who have escaped the immediate drama of execution but remain tainted by it. He caught Holt's eye and looked away quickly. I wondered what tale he would tell later, when describing this day to someone who had not been there. How many details would change with each retelling? How much would be shaped by Monstrum and other such books, rather than by the evidence of his own senses? "You plan to follow him," I said. For a man who claimed to owe nothing, Holt hesitated just long enough to betray the thought. Then he nodded. "There is business yet," he said. and sometimes it is useful to see how another hand holds a sword. You could simply watch from a distance, I suggested. His mouth tightened. Distance is a luxury for people whose bones are not already counting the seasons. Only then did I notice the faint stiffness when he shifted in his seat, the way his hand went briefly to his side, to the old scar I had stitched. I had assumed the heaviness I saw in him was the weight of experience. Now I wondered if there was more. Age creeps up on everyone, even those whose blood has been altered by trial and potion. Some joints do not care how many mutations guard the nerves above them. With the bluntness that comes from long days among the sick, I asked about his health. He deflected the question at first, claiming that witches heal fast. I reminded him that fast is not the same as forever. Eventually, he admitted that certain injuries had stopped mending as cleanly, that certain exertions left him more winded than before. "It is nothing," he said, "a touch of winter in the bones." I had heard the same from old farmers whose lungs rattled with every breath. A touch of winter can become a permanent season if ignored. I offered to examine him more thoroughly when there was time. He gave me that narrow look witches reserve for offers that smell faintly of traps and gratitude. "We will see," he said. The escort began its slow movement out of town. Geralt rode near the middle, his sword returned to him, but still watched by wary eyes. Holt rose, set his empty tankard aside, and adjusted the strap of his scabbard. "Come along if you wish," he told me without ceremony. "The road can always use another man who knows how to stitch. The labourers on the border works will pay in coin or food, and witches are generous with stories when they are tired enough." I hesitated. My practice in Rockamora was not established. I had been travelling already, called in to supervise the health of workers sent to clear new ground for some noble's latest ambition. Following Holt and Geralt would not be a great deviation from my path. Yet there is always a moment of decision when a man chooses which road to take at a literal or figurative crossroads. In the end, it was the book that tipped the scale, though I did not yet know its full importance. I had seen copies of Monstrum in the priest's chambers, heard snatches of its rhetoric from the mouths of men who had never read it fully. To walk beside witches for a while, to watch them work, seemed the only honest way to decide whether the ink deserved the authority it claimed. So I gathered my satchel and joined the slow procession as it wound out of Rockamora. Snow leached colour from the world, turning roofs and fields into a single pale sheet. The ravens from the gallows followed us for a time, black marks against the low sky. The first hours on the road were uneventful. Soldiers muttered about cold fingers and poor pay. Geralt rode in silence, his gaze fixed on some point ahead that only he could see. Holt remained a short distance behind the column, neither fully part of it nor wholly separate. I walked alongside a wagon where a labourer with a bandaged leg grumbled about the mud, and asked whether he would limp forever. I assured him that with rest and care he would likely walk without pain again, though I knew full well that the work waiting for him would not permit as much rest as his bones required. Life along the road is built of such small negotiations with reality. You promise sleep to a mother with a sick child, knowing she will not close her eyes until the fever breaks. You promise fair weather to a mason whose hands crack in the frost, though the clouds have already chosen otherwise. We keep offering these small comforts, because without them the days would grind down even the strongest among us. As the sun slid lower, Holt rode up beside me. "You watch more closely than most," he said, "for a man who claims no stake in these affairs." I told him that a physician's stake is always the same. Flesh is flesh, whether it wears a medallion or a rosary. He considered that. Then he said quietly that soon I would see the deeper knots in this tangle. A name waited on the road ahead, a name written in the front of a certain book and in the scars on Holt's conscience. When he spoke that name, Artemon of Askuth, something shifted in his tone, a mixture of contempt and something closer to grief. It was the first hint I had that Monstrum was not just a volume of slander, but the end of a friendship and the beginning of a private war. We still cannot help but wonder whether the gravest wounds are those carved into flesh, or the ones left when trust hardens into ink, and is passed from hand to hand as if it were holy truth. The road bent slowly toward the hills, and with each turn the snow thinned, giving way to patches of dark soil and stubborn grass. The soldiers who escorted Geralt began to relax, their shoulders less hunched, their jokes a little louder. A man will always talk more easily when he believes the worst is behind him. Holt kept to the rear, near the last wagon, his gaze moving not over the countryside, but over the people within it. I walked near him, my satchel thumping softly against my hip. We passed a wayside shrine splashed with fading paint. A woman knelt there, lips moving over a prayer for a good harvest, for healthy livestock, for sons who would come home from the wars with all their limbs and their wits. No one prayed aloud for witches. When they spoke of such men at all, it was usually to ask the gods to take them far away. By afternoon we reached a place the locals called the Crossroads of Ravens. The name came to it honestly. 4 roads met there, forming a rough star in the hard earth, and above the central post a stand of leafless trees spread their branches like a black net. Ravens clustered in that tangle, dozens of them, their feathers glossy despite the cold. They watched the approaching column with the fascinated stillness of creatures that understand death in a language older than ours. We halted there to rest the horses and let the men gnaw on dried meat and crusts of bread. Geralt dismounted and stretched, the joints in his shoulders and neck making small sounds that only a physician would notice. He rolled his wrists as if feeling for the echo of the rope that had not claimed him. Some ghosts wrapped themselves around the limbs rather than the throat. I went about my work, checking on the labourer with the injured leg, adjusting a bandage here, handing out a herbal lozenge there. The tasks were simple, almost comforting. A sore throat in a council of kings is still just a sore throat. For a time, the world shrinks to the warmth of a cup in the hand, the way crumbs cling to a beard, the creak of leather as a man finally allows himself to sit. Even among witches and ravens, life insists on these small, ordinary moments. When I had finished, I wandered toward the edge of the clearing. Holt stood there with Geralt, a little apart from the soldiers. The horses were picking at a patch of frost-burnt grass. The wind shifted, carrying their voices toward me. I did not intend to eavesdrop, yet once you have devoted your life to listening for things unsaid, it is difficult to turn your ears away. You handled yourself poorly in Rockamora, Holt said. Geralt's reply was very quiet. I did what seemed right at the time. Right is expensive, Holt answered. You should know that by now. There was no anger in his tone, only a tired conviction that spoke of many such conversations. I had heard similar words from older soldiers to younger ones, after a battle where someone had charged a little too far, lingered a little too long. Experience teaches that the line between courage and folly is thinner than any blade. Witches, it seemed, obeyed a similar geometry. I stepped closer, making just enough noise that my presence could not be mistaken for sneaking. Holt glanced over his shoulder, measured me with a brief look, and did not send me away. That, from a witcher, counts as an invitation. Ravens shifted above us, sending down the occasional feather. One of them landed near my boot. Most men would have taken that as a bad sign. I had seen enough births and funerals to know that feathers, like snow, fall where they will. Holt said a name then, Artemon of Asgoth. Geralt's jaw tightened. I had not heard the name spoken aloud before that day, though I had seen it years later inside the front cover of a certain infamous book. On that road, under the watching birds, I did not yet know all that the name carried. I knew only that it hung between the two witches like a shared scar. "You have heard of him," Holt said to me, as if continuing a conversation that had begun elsewhere. "A little," I answered, "in passing. A mage, a scholar, a man who writes." "A man who writes very well," Holt said. "So well that people forget to ask whether his words are true." Geralt spoke for the first time directly to me. "There is a book by him," he said. "You have seen it?" "Monstrum," I said. The way both witches looked at me in that instant reminded me that a physician carries not only herbs and needles, but knowledge. And that knowledge can be as dangerous as any sword. "Where did you see it?" Holt asked. "In the library of a temple," I replied. "In the hands of priests and magistrates. In the satchel of a merchant who liked to rant about unnatural creatures over his supper. It travels well." Holt's mouth twisted. "I imagine the inksmiths are grateful. Fear is a fine business." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a volume. Even before I saw the cover, I knew what it was. The same crude ravens, the same title, stamped in letters that aspired to grandeur. This copy was more worn than the one I had held later in my infirmary, the leather darkened by years of use. He handed it to Geralt, who held it as one might hold a snake that has not yet decided who it will bite. "You should read it," Holt said. "It is a kind of mirror. A crooked one, but still a mirror. Better to know how you look in the eyes of those who think they understand you. Witches are not known for their love of reading." Geralt glanced at the pages with clear reluctance. Yet he did not refuse. His fingers traced the edge of the cover. Then he opened it. My own hand itched to snatch the book away, to shield him from the venom I knew lay within. Physicians feel a similar urge when a patient insists on examining the contents of a wound. We want to protect them from sights that may linger longer than the pain. I reminded Holt of the line I had seen years later in another copy, that faint, marginal note. "Someone wrote in one of these books," I said. "You know better than this, Artemon." For the first time that day, Holt seemed truly startled. "Where?" he asked. "In a cathedral library in Caedwen," I told him. The ink was old. The hand was precise. It looked like the writing of a man accustomed to making careful cuts, not only in flesh, but in ideas. Geralt looked up from the page. "Yours," he said to Holt. Holt did not deny it. He gazed past us toward the thin line of the horizon. For a heartbeat, the wind snapped his cloak around his legs, and I saw in him not the tired hunter of monsters, but the younger man he must once have been, standing beside a colleague over a table strewn with diagrams and notes, arguing about what could be done and what should be forbidden. "He was my friend," Holt said quietly. Or I thought he was. We studied the same subjects. We shared the same doubts. We agreed that whatever was done to children in the name of the trials should at least be understood in every detail. Knowledge as a form of penance, he called it. I believed him. The wind fell still again. Later, when he published this, Holt continued. He dedicated it to me, to Preston, whose conscience was always too tender for his own good. A fine jest. Bitterness sharpened his voice, though the volume remained low. I imagined two young men in a distant tower, one with the even eyes of a witcher, the other with the restless gaze of a mage, bending over texts and tinctures as if the world could be made better by dissecting it. I imagined the day one of them chose to bind his conscience between covers, to turn doubt into dogma, and the other realized too late what had been unleashed. Geralt closed the book and handed it back. "So you want him dead," he said. Holt nodded. "Among other things, you could have gone alone," Geralt observed. "I could have," Holt agreed. "But if this is to be an ending, it may as well serve more than one purpose. There are truths to be exposed, and a younger pair of eyes to see how deep this rot runs." The ravens shifted, a fluttering of black against grey. One of them called out, a harsh sound that made the horses toss their heads. A soldier cursed and threw a stone that never reached its mark. I thought of the copy of Monstrum that had come through my hands, of the way priests cited its lines as if reading from Scripture, of the way merchants used it to justify turning away hungry boys at their doors. It had grown beyond its author, as words often do. Even if Holt achieved his revenge, the book would remain, scattered across the continent like embers after a fire. "You hope to end him," I said to Holt. "What do you hope to do with the book?" He looked at me then with something like respect. "One step at a time," he answered. "We start with the hand that held the pen. Later, perhaps, we speak with those who use these pages as a shield for their own cruelty." The soldiers began to call out that it was time to move on. Fires were stamped out, packs lifted. The crossroads slowly emptied, leaving only tracks and feathers and the fading echo of voices. As we set out again, I walked between the two witches. To my right, the younger man whose life had almost ended that morning. To my left, the older one whose life's purpose had narrowed to a line of ink on a title page. I felt suddenly very small between them, a simple healer with a bag of herbs and a head full of doubts. We still cannot help but wonder whether the most dangerous crossroads are marked by signposts in the earth, or by the moment a man decides which story about himself and others he will allow to harden into truth. We reached the village at dusk 2 days later. No one had thought it important enough to carve its name on a signpost. On maps, it was only a faint dot where the road thinned and the marsh pressed in close on both sides. Houses stood on short stilts above the wet ground, their walls patched with whatever scrap wood people could find. Smoke rose in thin threads that smelled of peat and boiled cabbage. In such places, real news moves slowly, but fear always runs ahead. The soldiers had turned back at the last main crossroads, satisfied that they had walked Geralt far enough from Rockamora to call their duty fulfilled. I watched them ride away with mixed relief. Their presence had been a shield of sorts, but also a weight. Fear clung to them more stubbornly than their own sweat. Once they were gone, the world felt both wider and less forgiving. Holt, Geralt and I stood a moment in the road, listening to the clatter of hooves fade into the cold air. Holt jerked his chin toward the cluster of huts and the flat glimmer of marsh beyond. "Work first," he said. Questions later, we did not stride in like heroes from a ballad. Witches learn quickly that loud arrivals invite loud trouble. Holt walked ahead, medallion at his throat, sword at his back. Geralt followed a step behind, copying his pace almost exactly. I came last with my satchel, the least alarming of the three. A physician is often mistaken for a peddler until someone actually needs him, and I have grown used to that first underestimation. The first villager we saw was a boy filling buckets at a communal well. He froze when he noticed the witches, then bolted for the nearest doorway. In a few heartbeats, shutters slammed along the street. Dogs barked and were dragged indoors. The village folded in on itself like a body curling around a bruise. Holt did not hammer on doors or shout for attention. He walked instead to the small shrine at the centre and waited there, hands loose at his sides, as if he had all night. It was the stance of a man who has come to bargain, not to raid. Geralt mirrored him, though his shoulders were a shade too tight, like a young apprentice standing beside a master in a surgery for the first time. Curiosity is stubborn even in frightened hearts. It pushes up like a weed through hard soil. An older man stepped out at last, followed by two others. Their coats were patched, their faces lined by damp work and bad sleep. One held a pitchfork, not quite pointing it at anyone, but not quite lowering it either. "You are witches," the first man said. Stating the obvious buys time while the mind shuttles between panic and hope. Holt nodded once. "We heard you had trouble," he answered. The story came out in fragments at first, then faster once the words found their path. Something had begun to come from the marsh after dusk. A cow taken here, a goat there, then a boy who had gone to fetch water and never returned. Men who went searching had found only churned mud and a patch of water that bubbled as if something heavy had just slipped beneath. They had sent to the nearest town. The priest there had said that if they wanted help, they must offer coin. They had gathered what they could and waited. A priest recommending a witcher. Somewhere that day, a copy of Monstrum must have been lying face down on its shelf. Holt questioned them with patient precision. At what hour did the air grow strange? Had anyone heard voices by the water? Had lights been seen over the reeds? He listened the way I have heard good midwives listen to a labouring woman, weighing every gasp and pause. Geralt watched, then began to add his own questions, shorter and sharper. His gaze narrowed when the men spoke of corpse-smelling wind and shapes half seen in mist. "Drowners," he said quietly when they fell silent, or something close enough to them. The word made them flinch. Names often frighten people more than claws. I had seen the same in sick rooms. A fever is one thing. Call it pox, and the air in the house tightens like a pulled cord. Yet, without names, we cannot do our work. You cannot treat what you refuse to face. Payment was discussed. There was not much to bargain over. The village could offer food, straw pallets, and a handful of coins, worn smooth by years of passing from palm to palm. Holt accepted without haggling, which did more to calm them than any fine speech would have done. A fair price looks like mercy to those unused to it. I promised to tend anyone injured during the night, and though I have learned to be sparing with promises, that one I meant. We were given a low hut near the marsh edge. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and damp reeds. Holt sat at the rough table and laid out his gear with the economy of long habit. Blades, oils, a whetstone, a small bundle of dried herbs that did not grow in Kedweni fields. Geralt did the same, his movements quicker but less polished, like handwriting that is legible but not yet graceful. Over a small fire he brewed a potion whose colour shifted from dull cloud to a faint poisonous shine. "You will drink that?" I said. "If needed," he replied. I had read of witcher decoctions in drier books than Monstrum. They sharpen the senses and harden muscle and nerve, but they also strain the heart like a bell rope pulled too hard. A few swallows can make a man faster than common flesh has any right to be. Too much can still that same heart forever. It is not so different from some tinctures in my own trade. A pinch eases pain. A pinch more sends a man into a sleep from which he does not return. Everything truly useful walks arm in arm with danger. While they worked, I stepped outside. The sun was sinking, washing the marsh in a thin copper light. Mist clung low among the reeds. Somewhere out there, something moved with a heavy, careful sound. The villagers were bolting their doors. Flames blinked behind shutters like small besieged eyes. City folk talk a great deal about monsters, as if they are the only threat in a peasant's life. They forget the quieter enemies: failed harvests, unpaid taxes, illness that arrives in a stranger's lungs and never quite leaves. A night of drowners tearing at the edge of the village is dramatic. Hunger is less theatrical, yet it devours more thoroughly. After dark, Holt and Geralt took their positions. Holt chose a patch of firmer ground where the marsh path met the last dry hummock. Geralt stationed himself farther along, near a narrow strip of planks the villagers used to cut peat. They had argued quietly about who should stand where. Holt insisted on the point of greatest risk. In the end, the younger man yielded. Experience still held rank. I stayed nearer the huts, where I could reach either of them quickly with bandages and whatever courage I could scrape together. I told myself this was good sense. A healer dead on the front line is no use to anyone. Yet I will not pretend there was no relief in standing just inside the ring of human warmth. Even those of us who live among the dying prefer, when we can, to keep our backs to living walls. The marsh began to speak as the night deepened. Frogs chimed. Insects wove thin, buzzing threads. Now and then something slid through the water with a slow, slick sound. Geralt whistled once, a low note to soothe a restless horse. Holt stood as still as the posts that held up the village houses. Then the sound peeled away. The frogs fell silent. The insects too. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. A smell rose from the marsh, metallic and stale, like meat left too long in a pantry. Over the black water, a weak glow appeared, bobbing as if someone carried a lantern with an unsteady hand. 3 shapes pulled themselves from the darkness beneath it. Pale and elongated, moving in a shambling half-crouch that mocked the human walk. They were not the worst creatures I have seen. There were no grand displays of horror, such as bards love to sing. Yet their almost human outline unsettled me more than any dragon's tooth might have done. Monstrum would have called them unclean mockeries, swollen with hatred. My own eyes noted simpler facts. Limbs too long, fingers joined by webbing, skin that looked as if it had forgotten the feel of sun. Geralt moved first, swift and spare. Holt waited until the creatures began to fan out, then stepped from the shadows at an angle. There was no shouting, no flourish, only a rhythm of motion that reminded me again of surgery. Cuts made exactly where they must be, no more, no less. Where a tavern tale might see a wild dance, I saw the careful arithmetic of trained bodies spending their strength with precision. One of the things lunged farther than expected. Its claws scraped Holt's forearm. I saw him twist just enough to turn a dangerous blow into a shallow line. When it was over and the last pale shape sank back into the dark water, his sleeve carried a narrow stripe that did not belong to the marsh. The night slowly exhaled. Frogs found their voices again. Somewhere in the village, a child cried out in its sleep and was soothed by a sleepy song. I crossed the churned mud to Holt and rolled back his sleeve. The cut was not deep, but the flesh around it looked wrong, edged with a faint grey. I cleaned it with water and herbs that draw out swamp rot. He watched my hands with that same detached interest, as if we both observed the body of some third man. "You see," he said to Geralt, who stood wiping his blade on a tuft of grass, "this is the part the book never truly shows them. We are not the horror at the edge of the fire. We are the ones who step into it so they can sleep through the night." Geralt did not answer. Perhaps he was thinking of the gallows at Rockamora, or of the villagers who had hidden behind bolted doors while 2 strangers bled for them in the dark. Or perhaps, as often happens when danger ebbs, his mind had emptied to leave only the weight of steel in his hand and the dull ache in his muscles. We still cannot help but wonder whether people fear monsters less for what they do, and more for the uncomfortable reminder that someone must face them while everyone else closes their eyes. The morning after the marsh hunt, the village smelled of fried dough and relief. People emerged from their houses with the hesitant steps of men and women who half expected the night's horror to have left teeth marks on their threshold. When they saw that the huts were still standing and no new names needed to be whispered over candles, their shoulders slackened in a way no physician's potion can achieve. The elder pressed a bundle of coins into Holt's palm and added a cured ham that had clearly been meant for a festival. "Payment for having our children wake to birdsong and not screaming," he said. There was a rough dignity in his voice. Holt accepted without theatrics. Geralt muttered that they could have kept the better part of it, yet his fingers closed around the ham with unmistakable practicality. Witches, for all their grim reputation, do not have the luxury of refusing honest bread. I spent the morning in quieter work. A woman brought me a child with a swollen ankle from a fall the day before. I examined the joint, reassured them that nothing was broken, and showed the boy how to wrap it properly. He listened with solemn attention until I compared the ankle to a stubborn mule that needed gentle tying, at which he grinned and promised to keep it still. It is curious how a simple joke shared over a bandage can sometimes heal more than the herbs beneath the cloth. By noon we were ready to leave. The village saw us off from a cautious distance, as if any closer gratitude might invite attention from whichever forces governed the marsh. As we rode away along the raised causeway, I glanced back once. Smoke rose from the chimneys in thin, straight lines. Children chased a dog between the huts. The marsh, which had gaped like a dark mouth the previous night, lay smooth as tarnished glass. Life, given the smallest chance, resumes. We followed a road that curved north and east, toward larger settlements where rumour travelled faster. Holt rode ahead, Geralt a little behind him, the two witches framed against the pale sky like dark strokes on grey paper. I walked with one hand on my satchel and the other tucked into my coat when the wind turned sharp. The countryside opened out, fields scraped bare by winter, hedges skeletal along drainage ditches. It was somewhere on that stretch that Holt asked without preamble where I had first seen Monstrum. I thought for a moment, sifting through my own memory. Books leave marks, but not always in the order one expects. A small chapel near Caer Gallen, I said at last. The priest there kept a copy near his pulpit. He liked to read from it when he wanted his flock to feel especially grateful that they were ordinary. What passages? Holt asked. The ones about a witcher who took payment in the blood of unbaptized infants, I said. The villagers shuddered satisfyingly at that. No one in that parish had ever seen a witcher in the flesh, but they knew exactly how they would behave if one ever came. Geralt snorted softly, an impressive feat to be both mythical terror and convenient scapegoat. I told them of other sightings. A merchant caravan where a battered copy lay beside the accounts ledger, its margins stained with grease. The man liked to quote it when turning away travellers who looked too poor or too strange, explaining that he had a duty to protect decent people from the influence of unnatural wanderers. In another town, I saw Monstrum chained to a lectern in the law hall, consulted like a reference text when debating what to do with vagrants and hedge mages. Its pages bore the smudges of many fingers, most of which had never touched a real spell or a real monster. It spreads like a mild fever, I said. Never severe enough to empty whole streets, but persistent enough that, after a while, everyone has a little cough of suspicion. Holt listened with that still focus of his. "You understand?" he said. "That was never how it began. You wrote in it," I said. "That line in the margin. You know better than this, so you saw its beginnings." He nodded once. Arteman wanted to write an account of the trials and the work. At first, it was meant to be for other scholars, a chronicle of methods and results. Dry as sawdust, there were pages of figures, charts of survival rates according to potion ratios. He said that facing the numbers would force the world to acknowledge what it demanded from children, given over to the path. "And you believed him?" I said. "I believed in counting the dead," Holt replied. It seemed more honest than pretending they were just stories told in taverns. Geralt rode in silence for a while, his gaze flicking between us and the road. "So how did it turn into this?" he asked finally, and tapped the spine of the book tied to Holt's saddle. Holt's mouth tightened. Somewhere along the way, Arteman discovered that outrage sells better than statistics. He began to shape the story. The same figures could be made to prove that witches were necessary guardians, tragic tools shaped by a cruel world, or that they were abominations, whose existence condemned the world that made them. Guess which version won him generous patrons and invitations to speak at courts. I could imagine the scene too well. A hall full of richly dressed men and women, listening with fascinated horror as a clever mage described children screaming on laboratory tables, mutations twisting bone and flesh, bloodlines tainted forever. All of it real enough to sting, yet arranged so that the conclusion suited their existing fears. No one wants to hear that they are complicit in the necessary ugliness that keeps their walls safe. They prefer to believe that the ugliness itself is the enemy. In Oxenfurt, I once heard a young lecturer quote Monstrum. When arguing that witches should be banned from entering universities, I said. He had never met one, but he liked the sound of his own fear. Geralt's mouth curved, humorless. I am heartbroken to be missing such hospitality. Holt's gaze went distant. What stings most, he said, is not that he criticized us. Some criticism is deserved. The trials are monstrous by any reasonable measure. What stings is that he chose to cast us as monsters without faces, while keeping his own hands clean, as if ink absolved him. We passed a field where a farmer was mending a fence. He paused to watch us, one hand resting on the post. When he saw the medallions at Holt's and Geralt's throats, his expression tightened. Not hatred, exactly. Wariness. He glanced toward his house, where smoke rose from a narrow chimney, then returned to his work without a word. It struck me that Monstrum had been written for men like him as much as for scholars and priests. It gave shape to the vague unease that ordinary folk felt when confronted with men who walked unscarred from battles that would have shredded any normal body. It told them that their fear was justified, that witches were not only different, but dangerous, tainted, unholy. It flattered them by suggesting that their simple mortal frailty was a sign of moral superiority. It is easier to feed a family turnips every day if you are convinced that finer food would poison you. We made camp that night near a copse of bare alders. The wind had teeth, so we built the fire higher than we might have otherwise, trusting the emptiness of the land to hide its light. Geralt sat with Monstrum in his hands, the fire glossing its ravens in sickly gold. He read in short bursts, jaw tightening now and then at some particularly vile passage. Holt pretended not to watch him, which is the surest sign that he cared very much how the younger man would react. I brewed a mild tea for myself, the sort that eases the tightness of the chest in cold weather. When I offered some to Holt, he waved it away with a faint grimace, claiming that witches have little use for gentle remedies. I told him that was precisely why so many of them crack like badly fired pottery in old age. He almost smiled at that, and muttered that I had been spending too long among temple healers. Geralt shut the book with more force than was strictly necessary. "If a peasant read only this," he said, "and then met me on the road, he would think he knew everything he needed to know." Holt nodded. "You are a monster of ink before you are a man of flesh." Geralt poked at the fire with a stick. Sparks flew upward, swallowed quickly by the dark. "Words cut cleaner than swords," he said, "and the scars do not show." We sat with that thought for a while, listening to the crackle of wood and the distant bark of a fox. In the quiet, my mind went back to patients I had lost, because they came too late, not daring to trust a physician until their illness had wrapped itself around their bones. Perhaps they too had read something once, or heard a sermon, or listened to a neighbour's warning that healers meddled in the body, the way mages meddled in the unseen. We still cannot help but wonder whether the deepest monsters we face are born from mutagens and marshes, or from the stories that teach us to fear the wrong things, until the help we most need looks to us like the very threat we should flee. Newhold announced itself long before we saw its walls. The air thickened with coal smoke and tannery stench, the unmistakable perfume of a town that believed in industry more than in beauty. Ruts in the road deepened, cut by wagon wheels heavy with ore and lumber. The occasional lone cottage gave way to outlying workshops, low brick buildings with chimneys that coughed black into the grey sky. By the time the city's wooden palisade rose before us, my throat was already sore from breathing its ambition. Traders called Neuhold a place on the rise. Its markets bustled, its guilds squabbled. Its temple coffers grew stout. Growth is a fever, though, and like any fever, it brings sweat and delirium along with energy. The guards at the gate looked us over with the wary calculation of men who had been told to welcome coin and keep out trouble, two tasks that rarely align. Their eyes lingered on the wolf medallions at Holt's and Geralt's throats. "Witches," one of them said, making the word sound like a bad taste that had somehow ended up on his tongue. "Witches with contracts," Holt replied. "I hear your council posted a notice, something about a beast in the river quarter." The man hesitated, then shrugged. "The notice is still up. Whether they still want it filled is another question." That answer told me more than he intended. Towns do not change their minds about wanting monsters removed unless they have found some other use for their fear. Inside the gate, Neuhold threw itself at the senses. Carts creaked through narrow streets. Hawkers shouted over one another, offering smoked fish, bolts of wool, cheap trinkets with charms scratched into them. Children wove between legs, chasing one another and the smell of roasting chestnuts. The temple of Melitele stood on a rise near the centre, its bell tower catching what little light broke through the clouds. Somewhere in its quiet halls, a priestess lit candles and prayed for wisdom, while the city below conducted its own rough rituals. We went first to the council hall, a wide stone building whose doorway was flanked by figures meant to resemble wise judges. Time and pigeon droppings had not been kind to them. Inside, a clerk informed us that the council was in session and witches were not invited. Holt stared at him for a long moment. For a heartbeat, I thought he might simply push past. Yet he only inclined his head and asked in the mildest tone whether they preferred to discuss the problem while it continued to eat their citizens. That word, eat, carried. In the end, we were ushered into an antechamber to wait. Physicians know well the dignity afforded to those whose presence is necessary yet unwelcome. I found a bench with only one broken leg, and sat, listening to the muffled roar of debate from beyond the carved doors. It was in that stuffy room that I first saw a copy of Monstrum, displayed with true reverence. It lay on a small table beside a platter of fruit and a jug of watered wine, as if another guest at the council, an authority to be consulted between sips. This edition was bound in red leather, the title picked out in careful gilding. Someone had slipped a silk ribbon between its pages, so that it lay open at a chapter whose heading I recognized: On Witches and the Stoking of Unrest Among the Populace. I resisted the urge to close it. A runner burst in at last, hair damp with sweat. "There has been another attack," he gasped. "By the river. They are dragging bodies out now." The council doors flew open. Voices spilled through, sharp and frightened. In the confusion, Holt stepped into the hall as if he had been summoned. Geralt and I followed. No one stopped us. It is remarkably easy to pass through barriers when panic has already opened every gate. The scene by the river was chaotic even by city standards. A crowd had gathered on the embankment, held barely in check by a line of militia with spears held sideways. In the water below, men struggled with poles and ropes, trying to steer something slumped and pale toward the shore. The river here ran slow and brown, thick with the runoff of tanneries and dye works. It seemed almost reluctant to give up what it held. When the first body was hauled onto the stones, the crowd groaned as if struck. It had been a woman once, perhaps no older than 30. Now she was a ruin of bruises and torn flesh, her limbs twisted by more than water. I knelt beside her, out of habit, fingers searching for pulses my eyes already knew I would not find. A child in the front rank sobbed into his mother's skirts. Someone began to pray aloud, words tumbling over one another without coherence. There were 3 dead altogether, 2 women and 1 man, all taken near the water's edge according to the babbled accounts, dragged under with terrifying speed. Those who had witnessed it could agree on very little beyond the sudden churn of the river and the glint of something pale in the murk. People see poorly when fear has already chosen the shape of what it wants to remember. Geralt stood very still, his gaze on the wounds. He did not flinch. Witches learn early to look directly at what others prefer to glance past. He asked a few questions, short and sharp, of those close enough to have seen more than froth and screaming. What time? How far from the bridge? How deep the water? His manner was precise rather than compassionate, yet I saw some of the panic in their faces ease under the weight of simple, practical inquiry. When a man asks you where, when, how many, he gives you back the sense that something can still be done. The councilmen arrived in a posse of fine cloaks and pale faces. One of them, a broad man with a neck like a butcher's block, took one look at the corpses and then at Geralt. "You," he said, as if calling out a debt. "You are the Witcher." "I am," Geralt answered. "You will deal with this," the councillor declared. "If you can rid us of whatever hunts in the river, Neuhold will pay. You have my word." His word glittered like coin in the cold air. The crowd listened, desperate to believe that a single sword arm could cut through the tangle of their fear. When Geralt nodded, a murmur of approval ran through them. Someone clapped him on the shoulder. A woman pressed a little bread into his hand, mumbling that Melitele watch over him. For a brief, bright moment, he was exactly what ballads promise. A hero arrived at the darkest hour. The investigation that followed was work, not legend. Geralt and Holt prowled the riverbank, eyes and ears searching for signs the rest of us would have missed. I helped where I could, examining the bodies more thoroughly away from the crowd. The bruises and tearing spoke of something strong, with a jaw made for dragging prey downward. There were faint traces of slime in the deeper wounds, a smell that cut even through the reek of the river. Geralt nodded when I described it to him. An old thing disturbed, he said, not brought, not summoned, pushed from its usual hunting grounds by the filth they have poured into this water. The first time he attempted to kill it, the town watched from windows and bridges. Word of the witch's stand on the riverbank spread faster than the chill wind. People leaned out over parapets, eyes wide. Boys scampered along alleys, climbing onto barrels for a better view. For once, their attention landed on the monster and the man facing it, rather than on the book that called him an abomination. He baited the creature with a carcass, weighted and lowered into the shallows. The river accepted the offering without comment. Night fell. Lights glimmered along the houses, reflected in jittering shards on the water. When the surface finally broke, it did so with sudden violence. Later, those watching would describe a demon, a nightmare given flesh. In truth, it was something simpler, a massive, rubbery shape with small eyes and a mouth that split its head nearly in two. It was terrifying, yes, but in the way of all large predators, built to seize and hold, not to haunt dreams. Geralt waded into the churned shallows to meet it, blade flashing. Holt covered him from the bank, ready to strike if it lunged for him. The fight was ugly and cold and wet. There was no glorious leap, no clever quip. Just a series of calculated strikes, narrow escapes, and the grinding persistence of a man who has trained his whole life for such moments. In the end, the creature thrashed, shuddered, and went still. The river closed over its sinking bulk with a greedy gulp. A roar went up from the onlookers. Neuhold had its hero. For the space of a few heartbeats, Geralt stood in the raw light of simple gratitude. Men shouted his name. Women cheered. A boy near me lifted an imaginary sword and slashed at the air, face alight. I saw Geralt's shoulders ease just slightly, as if the weight he carried sat more comfortably for once. By morning, the story had already begun to warp. 3 taverns vied over whose version of the events would stick. In one, Geralt fought off a dozen beasts. In another, he swam under the creature and gutted it from below. In a third, he struck a bargain with the river itself, which demanded a sacrifice in return. Somewhere between ale mugs and fear, the line between gratitude and suspicion began to blur. I heard a woman at the market say that no ordinary man could move the way he had in the water. Her companion answered that perhaps no ordinary man should. A merchant claimed that it was witches like Geralt who lured such monsters closer, the better to earn their coin. Monstrum had a paragraph very like that, I recalled, about men who conjure threats in order to be paid to dispel them. By the time we reached the central square that afternoon, there was a new tone in the air. People still watched Geralt, but the warmth in their eyes had cooled to wary calculation. He had done his work too well. He had reminded them that he was not like them, and in such moments the book lying open on the council table whispers its lines most loudly. We still cannot help but wonder whether the road from hero to menace is truly as short as a single night, or whether it is paved carefully in advance by every tale that teaches us to distrust the hands that pull us back from the water. We left Neuhold under a sky the colour of old tin. The river slid away behind us. carrying with it the last whispers of the story that had already begun to twist in the city's taverns. Geralt rode in silence, shoulders set, as if braced against something heavier than the winter wind. Holt's gaze stayed on the road, but now and then I caught him studying the younger Witcher with the same concern I used when watching patients after a bad fever. "You took a hit," Holt said at last. "It was nothing," Geralt replied. "Nothing has a way of growing when you ignore it," I added. He did not argue. Witchers do not complain, which is not the same as denying the truth. The river fight had left more than fatigue in his limbs. There was a drag in his movements that had not been there before, a faint delay when he turned his head or shifted in the saddle. Small things, yet I have learned to trust such signs. Bodies whisper their troubles long before they start to shout. Holt made the decision by midday. "We turn toward the temple," he said. Geralt frowned. "I am not a pilgrim." "Nor am I," Holt answered. "But there is a priestess at the great temple of Melitele who has as much sense in her head as any surgeon has in his hands. I would have her look at you, and perhaps at me." He glanced at me when he said that last part, a flicker of wry acknowledgment. I had not forgotten the way he favoured his right side in the mornings, nor the stiffness that sometimes caught him when he thought no one was watching. The road south grew gentler as we left the smoke and grime of Neuhold behind. Fields lay fallow, waiting for spring. Vineyards clung to low hills, rows of bare stakes like ribs against the sky. We passed shrines to many small gods of road and harvest. At each, someone had left offerings of dried flowers or a crust of bread. Faith is rarely grand in the countryside. It is a series of small gestures made with cold fingers. After several days, the temple rose before us. It stood on a rise above a bend in the river. White stone, catching the light even under a dull sky. Towers and cloisters were softened by age rather than weathered by neglect. The air around it felt different, not because any miracle stirred there, but because a place dedicated to healing and birth carries its own gravity. People walk more quietly near such walls, even when they do not know why. I had studied under temple healers in my youth. Returning to one of their great houses years later felt like stepping back into a language I had almost forgotten. The courtyard was busy with novices carrying baskets of herbs, mothers with round bellies, old men who leaned on canes and hope in equal measure. Amid all that, 2 witches and a road-worn physician were only one more set of troubles to be sorted. Nenneke met us in the main hall. She was not what those who read Monstrum would expect of a high priestess. No frail mystic lost in visions. No severe ascetic wrapped in layers of piety. She stood broad and solid, her hair streaked with grey, her eyes as sharp as any surgeon's knife. When she looked at Holt and Geralt, there was no flinch, no superstition, only assessment. 2 witches and an old fool who still refuses to retire, she said. Radko, I had hoped the gods would grant you sense by now. Her voice carried a rough affection that made me smile despite myself. If they did, lady, I answered, they misplaced it before it reached me. She snorted, then turned back to Holt. You look thinner, Preston. I suppose you are still skipping meals whenever obsession calls. And this must be the river hero that Neuhold is already arguing about. Geralt inclined his head. Witches are rarely at ease in temples. Too many candles, too many eyes that claim to see beyond the surface. Nenneke ushered us into a smaller chamber lined with shelves. The air smelled of beeswax, dried flowers, and ink. Here the temple kept its records of births, deaths, and cures, written in hands more concerned with accuracy than with elegance. It comforted me to see that while the world argued about monsters, someone still took the trouble to note how many babies had survived the winter. "Sit," she told Geralt. "Let us see what the river left in you." I watched as she worked. Her manner was brisk, almost impatient, yet her hands were gentle. She asked about his symptoms and listened carefully to the answers, interrupting only to press fingers to pulse and ribs. She examined the faint bruising along his side, the way he winced when drawing breath too sharply. Fluid in the lungs, she concluded. Not enough to drown you standing, but enough to drag on you when you fight. You breathe as if you are carrying a weight under your ribs. If you keep working at your usual pace, that weight will grow. Geralt stiffened. Time is not something witches have in abundance. Nenneke regarded him levelly. You would rather die quickly than rest for a short while. How very original. I have heard that bravado from soldiers, miners, even carters who think the world cannot spare them long enough to lie still. The graves do not care how busy you thought you were. Holt almost smiled at that. She prescribed rest, warmth, and a draught bitter enough to make even a witcher grimace. Geralt obeyed with the reluctant obedience of a man who knows he has met someone he cannot argue away. I helped her measure the herbs, my hands falling into old patterns I had learned in temple kitchens. For a while, the years between now and my apprenticeship folded in on themselves. Then it was Holt's turn. He made a show of reluctance, but Nenneke had no patience for it. "Off with the shirt," she said. "I will not diagnose armor." The scars on his torso told their own long story. Claw marks, bite traces, the puckered line along his ribs that I recognized as my own work. Beneath them all, the subtler signs of age. Muscle that had lost some of its elasticity, skin that did not spring back quite as quickly under the fingers. She listened to his heart for a long time, her ear pressed to his chest, her hand on his back. When she straightened, her eyes were kinder. "You have pushed this body hard," she said. "Harder than most men ever could. It has served you well. It will continue to do so, if you accept that it is no longer a fresh blade, but an old one that needs careful sharpening and rest between battles." Holt's jaw clenched. There was something almost like fear in his eyes, quickly buried. "It is one thing to face down beasts and armed men. It is another to confront the slow betrayal of your own flesh." "How long?" he asked. "You are not dying tomorrow," she replied, "nor next month, unless you behave with particular foolishness. Yet if you chase every ghost from your past as if you were still 20, you will not see as many winters as you might." The silence that followed was heavy. Out on the road, Holt had spoken of Artemon with a ferocity that left no room for doubt. In this quiet room, confronted by the limits of his own body, that determination looked more fragile. Revenge sits easily on a young man's shoulders. On an older frame, it weighs much more. After the examinations, Nenneke poured us all a measure of something amber from a plain bottle. "Not medicine," she said when I raised an eyebrow. "Consolation. There is a difference." We drank. The liquid burned going down, then settled in the chest with a warmth that was not entirely physical. Outside, the temple bells marked the passing of the hour. Somewhere in the courtyard, children laughed. Life went about its business, indifferent to the dramas that had brought us here. She asked then about Monstrum. "Word travels," she said. "I have seen more copies in noble libraries these past years. Men who never troubled themselves about witches before now quote it to me when I ask them to send coin for winter blankets. They say they will not support houses that shelter monsters." Holt told her in few words of Artemon, of the marginal note, of his intent. She listened without interruption, her expression growing hard. So he found a way to turn guilt into virtue, she said. To condemn the very tools he once studied, and be praised for his moral clarity. Clever man, dangerous if left unchallenged. "You think I should not go after him?" Holt said. "I think," she replied, "that you must decide whether you are a hunter of monsters or of men who write books. Both need killing sometimes, but they leave different kinds of emptiness behind." Geralt spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "If we do nothing, the book goes on. Every priest who waves it from a pulpit, every magistrate who cites it when sending a witcher to the gallows, will be echoing Artemon." Nenneke nodded. "And if you kill him, what then? The ink will not dry up in its bottles. Others will copy his words, polish them, add their own. That is how ideas live on." Holt's hand closed around his cup. "Then at least he will hear a different opinion before he goes to whatever judgment waits for us all," he said. "He has had the lectern to himself for too long." She smiled at that, a small, tired curve of the lips. "Very well, Preston, chase your ghost. Just remember that you carry more than your own bones into this quarrel. Radko will see what it does to you. The boy will learn what it means to take on a man whose weapon is a pen. And the temple will keep dealing with the echoes in the hearts of those who read him. That is what faith does, I thought then. Not miracles and visions. It holds the line quietly while louder battles rage elsewhere. A woman tending a fevered child. A priestess bandaging a witch's arm. A physician counting the breaths of an old man in the night. We stayed at the temple for several days, long enough for Geralt's breathing to ease, for Holt to admit that his joints hurt less when he did not sleep on bare ground, for me to remember that there are places in the world where healing is the whole point, not an afterthought. Yet even within those safe walls, Monstrum's shadow lay across us. I saw it in the way a visiting noblewoman stiffened at the sight of Geralt, only relaxing when Nenneke spoke his name gently, as one would speak of a neighbour rather than a beast. I saw it in the way a novice glanced at Holt's medallion, then quickly away, as if ashamed of her own curiosity. We still cannot help but wonder whether sanctuaries like this temple are enough to mend what a single book has torn, or whether the deepest wounds must be confronted not only with herbs and prayers, but with the courage to look directly at the stories we have let shape our fear. It was on our third night at the temple that Holt finally let me see what the years had been doing to him. Until then, he had kept his weariness tucked away like a knife in a boot. Witches know how to hide their frayed edges. They have learned that people prefer their protectors to look invincible, and that any sign of frailty invites the sort of pity they cannot afford. The day had been quiet. Geralt spent most of it dozing under blankets that smelled of sun and lavender, his breathing less rough than when we arrived. I helped Nenneke and her novices in the herb garden, fingers numb with cold as we harvested the last hardy roots that had not yet surrendered to winter. In the evening we ate thick soup and coarse bread in the refectory. For a rare hour, conversation drifted away from monsters and books to the mundane concerns of the house. A cracked roof tile, a pregnant mare in the stables, a shipment of linens, delayed by snow. It is remarkable how comforting such trivial complaints can be. When someone is worrying aloud about leaky roofs, you know the world has not ended yet. Later, as the temple settled into its slow, breathing quiet, I found Holt alone in one of the side cloisters. The corridor opened onto a small inner court, where a bare-limbed tree had been planted long ago. Moonlight silvered its branches. Holt sat on a stone bench, elbows on his knees, head bowed. His sword leaned against the wall within easy reach. A witcher does not set it aside any farther than that. You should be sleeping, I said. He looked up. The lamplight from the far end of the corridor caught the hollows beneath his eyes. Sleep comes in smaller pieces these days, he answered. It is just as well. There is less time to waste. He tried to make it sound like a joke. It fell short of one. I sat beside him. The stone was cold even through my robe. For a while we said nothing. The temple bells marked the hour, their sound muted by distance and stone. Somewhere a novice coughed, then turned over in her bed. In the stillness, I could hear Holt's breath. It was steady, but there was a faint roughness at the end of each exhale, like the last rasp of a file on metal. You asked Nenneke the wrong question, I said at last. He raised an eyebrow. You asked how long, I continued, as if time were a single block she could hand you, with your name carved neatly on it. You should have asked how. How to spend what you have left without snapping the blade entirely. He huffed a small sound that might have been amusement. You want me to retire to a cottage, perhaps, he said. Take up beekeeping. Tell children stories by the fire. You would last 3 days before picking a quarrel with the hive, I said. No, I do not suggest you pretend to be a man you are not, but I know the look in your eyes, Preston. I have seen it in soldiers who survived 3 wars and then decided that one last glorious charge would give meaning to all that came before. Most of them died on fields no one remembers. He was silent a moment, staring at his hands. Witches' hands are deceptive. They are calloused, yes, but lean, almost elegant. You have to look closely to see the small tremors that linger after years of potions and battle. This is not about glory, he said softly. Then tell me what it is about, I replied. You brought me into this road. Let me at least know the name of the wound you are walking toward. For a long time I thought he would refuse. He had built thick walls around his past. Yet age has its own erosion. At last he sighed, a slow sound that seemed to leave him smaller on the bench. Very well, he said. You remember that I said Artemon and I once studied together. I nodded. We met in a Kaidweni stronghold, where the Order kept its records and its more inquisitive minds, he began. Mages, surgeons, alchemists, men and women who wanted to understand what the trials did, not only in poetry, but in bone and blood. Artemon was assigned to oversee certain aspects of the process. I was there as a subject who had survived it. You volunteered, I asked. A boy does not volunteer for the trials, he said. He is taken or given. But later, when I lived and others did not, I chose to stay near the place where it all happened. I told myself that if I understood it, if I could help make the potions less lethal, fewer children would die. It was a way to believe that my survival was worth something more than accident. His voice had gone distant, somewhere back among cold stone corridors and the smell of tinctures. Artemon was brilliant, Holt continued. He saw patterns where others saw numbers. He could look at a sheet of figures and tell you which mixture had given a boy a better chance. At first, that is what he cared about, making the process cleaner, safer, more predictable. I trusted him. At first, there came a day, he said, when we stood over a table with yet another dead apprentice on it. The boy had been 12. His body was marked by the usual signs: bleeding from nose and ears, muscles locked in final spasms. I was angry. Artemon was thoughtful. He said that the only way to truly understand why a body failed would be to watch it fail while it still fought, to observe the transformation in progress. I felt my stomach tighten. You disagreed, I said. I called it cruelty, wrapped in curiosity, Holt replied. He called it necessary. We quarrelled. Hard. I refused to stand by for such an experiment, and I told him that if he pursued it, I would drag him before every council that would hear me. He laughed, said I had developed scruples late in the game. He rubbed his fingers together as if trying to shake off some remembered sensation. A few months later, he left the fortress, Holt went on, took his notes and his clever tongue to the courts. When next I heard of him, he was lecturing nobles about the monstrosity of witches, using the same figures we had once studied together. Only now he arranged them to paint us as abominations rather than as victims of a brutal craft. And Monstrum, I said. That came soon after, Holt answered. At first it was just a manuscript circulated among scholars and priests. They loved it. A learned man condemning dangerous mutants. It made them feel virtuous and vindicated all at once. When it was published, he sent me a copy. He closed his eyes briefly. There was a dedication, he said, to Preston Holt, whose conscience could not bear the truth. May this work bring that truth into light. That was when you wrote the note, I said. You know better than this, he repeated. Yes. I wrote that in the margin and sent the book back to him with a letter. I told him that he had turned knowledge into a weapon pointed at the wrong throats, that he had abandoned the boys whose deaths we counted to seek applause from people who would never risk their own children in such experiments. Did he answer? I asked. In his way, Holt said. He kept publishing. He visited temples and courts, warned anyone who would listen that witches were unstable, dangerous, spiritually corrupt. He made sure that whenever one of us faltered, whenever a contract went wrong, his words were there to frame the tale. He leaned back against the wall, staring up at the strip of sky visible above the courtyard. So yes, Radko, he said, I want him to answer for that, not just for slandering us, but for betraying the children he once claimed to mourn, and for twisting your own guilt, I added quietly, into a weapon he could use. He did not deny it. You think this is about my conscience, he said. Perhaps you are right. I have killed more monsters than I can remember. I tell myself that balances the scales. But the worst thing I ever did was stand beside those tables and convince myself that by watching boys die, I was making their deaths count. Artemon took that shared sin and made a sermon of it. I have been listening to his sermon echo ever since. The tree in the courtyard creaked softly in the wind. Somewhere above us, a raven shifted on the rooftop, claws scraping slate. Their kind seemed drawn to crossroads of all sorts, whether marked by stones or by choices that cannot be unmade. "What do you want from Artemon now?" I asked. "Confession, remorse, blood." He was silent a long time. "I want him to look at one witcher who survived the trials he described and admit that we are not the caricatures he drew," Holt said at last. "I want him to hear from Geralt what his book has done, how many ropes have been tied a little tighter, because his words were close to hand. And if he refuses," I asked, "then I end what I began when I wrote that note in his margin," he said. "I close the book in a sense he never intended." Wind moved through the courtyard, carrying the faint smell of incense from the main hall. I thought of the copy of Monstrum that lay in my infirmary miles away, with its small rebuke written where few would ever see it. One line of ink against hundreds of pages. One man's refusal to agree swallowed by the louder voice of fear. "You plan to use Geralt," I said. "You bring him because he is young, because his face still fits both the role of monster and of hero. He is your argument made flesh." Holt's jaw tightened. "He is also a witcher who deserves to know why the world greets him with nooses as often as with coin," he said. "I will not pretend my motives are pure. They rarely have been. But I would rather he see the author of his condemnation than fight only its shadow." In that moment I felt a pang for Geralt, sleeping in a warm cell not far away, unaware of the shape of the net that others were weaving around him. So many of us older men claim to be guiding the young, when in truth we are dragging them toward the unfinished business of our own lives. We still cannot help but wonder whether the heaviest burdens we inherit are laid on us by fate or by the hands of those who cannot bear to set down the guilt they have carried alone for too long. We left the temple on a morning washed clean by rain. The flagstones in the courtyard still glistened, and the air smelled of wet stone and rosemary from the herb beds. Nenneker saw us to the gate with a loaf of dark bread and a last warning about taking stupid risks, which she delivered to Holt and Geralt, alike in equal measure. She told me to come back when my own joints finally admitted their age. I promised I would, though both of us knew that promises made on the road have a way of dissolving like mist. Geralt breathed more easily now. The rasp at the end of each inhalation had softened. He still coughed now and then, especially in the cold mornings, but the sound no longer dragged at him the way it had in Neuhold. Holt moved with his usual controlled precision, yet I noticed that he chose his pace with more care, as if the conversation in the cloister had scratched a thin line of caution into his stubbornness. For 2 days we rode in relative peace. The land rolled gently, patched with winter fields and strips of woodland. We passed farmers mending fences, women beating dust from rugs, children playing at chasing imaginary monsters with sticks. Once a little girl pointed at Geralt and whispered something to her brother. He shook his head firmly and said that real witches were taller. Geralt glanced at me, then with the closest thing to a grin I had seen on his face, the brief spark of a man amused that legend had already improved upon his height. On the third evening, clouds thickened and pressed low. We found shelter in a half-abandoned coaching inn that leaned against a hill beside the road. Its shutters rattled in the wind, and half the roof tiles were missing. But the main hearth still drew smoke, and the well in the yard gave water that did not taste of rust. The innkeep, a narrow man, with the look of someone who had grown accustomed to disappointment, accepted our coins and only flinched a little at the sight of medallions. We sat near the fire while the rain began in earnest, drumming on the roof in irregular bursts. The room smelled of damp wool and cabbage soup, but the flames cast a steady warmth that eased the chill from fingers and toes. A pair of carters dozed at a corner table. Their snores rose and fell like a slow, badly tuned choir. It was there that Holt brought out the special copy of Monstrum. Until then, I had seen only the red leather edition with its cracked spine and softened corners. That night, Holt unwrapped a second book from a piece of oilcloth kept deep in his pack. This one was smaller and bound in dark, almost black calfskin. The ravens on the cover were stamped with a finer hand, their wings picked out in lines that suggested real feathers rather than crude strokes. The title was the same, yet the letters seemed more deliberate, as if this had been the version Artemon intended for particular eyes. Holt placed it on the table between us. The candlelight caught at the gold of the lettering. "This is the first copy he sent me," he said, "before the cheaper editions spread. The dedication is inside." Geralt reached for it more cautiously than he would have taken up a new blade. He opened the front cover and read silently. His face did not change, but the knuckles of the hand that held the book whitened slightly. To Preston Holt, whose rare survival and troubled conscience first inspired these pages, that the truth might finally be given shape and shared with the world. Geralt read it aloud, his voice flat. Hearing the words spoken gave them a weight the ink alone could not carry. They landed between us like a stone in water, sending out ripples that bumped against old memories and fresh anger both. Holt's mouth curved in a smile that had no amusement in it. He always did enjoy sounding noble while cutting throats, he said. Geralt turned the next pages. The text marched on in ordered columns, the familiar accusations dressed in careful phrases. He skimmed with a growing restlessness, as if his eyes could not decide where to settle. Then his frown deepened. "Here," he said, "at the back." He flipped to the final pages and then farther, to a section I had not seen in other copies. There, on thicker paper, were drawings. Not the crude woodcuts of snarling beasts and twisted witcher faces that decorated common editions, but precise ink diagrams of human figures in motion. I recognized sword forms when I saw them. Any physician who has worked near battlefields learns the shapes that precede particular wounds. These figures were sketched in a clean, economical style, each one a frozen moment in a sequence. A man stood with his weight on his back leg, blade angled to deflect a downward strike. In the next, he twisted, bringing the sword around in a rising arc toward an opponent's unprotected side. Below each image, neat notes recorded angle, balance, probable outcome. Geralt studied them, eyes narrowing. "These are not guesses," he said. "Whoever drew them has seen the forms from arm's length, not across a courtyard." Holt nodded. "He watched me train once," he said. "Took notes while I worked. Said it would help him understand how the mutations changed muscle response. I told myself at the time that it was harmless. He reached across and tapped one of the sketches. "This one is mine," he added. "I remember the day in the yard. It was raining, mud everywhere. I slipped on a patch and nearly took my own knee out." He laughed, then drew my recovery step as if it were a deliberate flourish. The bitterness in his voice was not only about the past, but about the intimacy of the betrayal. There is a kind of nakedness in being observed so closely. Every craftsman knows it. When a novice watches your hands at work, you feel stripped down to callus and habit. To have that observation turned into accusation later is a particular cruelty. Geralt traced another figure with his fingertip. "This sequence," he said, "against multiple assailants. Step, cut, turn, low sweep. He has the timing almost exact." "Almost," Holt said. "Enough to impress a reader who has never held a sword. Not enough to teach anyone to survive. Even when he borrows from us, he keeps the advantage to himself." I looked more closely at the annotations. Among the technical notes, I found small asides. One described a certain counter as evidence of Witcher arrogance. Another likened a parry to a serpent strike, cold and unnatural. Even in the diagrams, Artemon could not resist telling his preferred story. "You see," Holt said quietly, "he did not hate us from a distance. He stood close enough to smell the sweat on my shirt. He knew the sound a sword makes when it cuts air correctly. This is not ignorance, it is choice." Outside, the rain beat harder against the shutters. The fire popped, sending up brief flares of light that glanced across Geralt's face. He closed the book gently and then reopened it to the diagrams. After a moment, he stood. "Come," he said to Holt, "show me exactly where he was standing when he drew these." We pushed the tables back, ignoring the disapproving mutters of the innkeep, who clearly had not imagined his common room would host anything more dramatic than spilled beer and the occasional argument about dice. The carters in the corner stirred, blinked at the sight of two witchers drawing steel indoors, and immediately decided that sleep was safer than curiosity. Holt moved as he must once have moved in that distant training yard, feet finding their old measure on uneven boards. Geralt took the mirror position opposite him. They began slowly, the forms first. Guard, step, cut, turn. The blades whistled softly in the air, a sound that to my ears has always been half promise, half threat. Then the pace quickened. The inn-room shrank around them, space defined not by walls, but by their awareness of one another. This was not a duel. It was a shared language, spoken with steel instead of tongues. I saw in Geralt's movements the younger strength, the raw power tempered by recent bruises. In Holt's, the experience that turns wasted motion into pain saved later. They ran through the sequence as it appeared in the book, then again with the corrections Holt muttered under his breath. A shift of the foot here, a lower guard there. Small changes that meant the difference between a glancing wound and a fatal one. "You see," he said to Geralt between passes, "he draws the angle too wide. A real opponent would be inside your guard by the time you finished this flourish. It looks fine on paper. On a field, it kills you." It struck me then that even now, in the middle of a journey fueled by anger and regret, Holt remained what the trials had made him, and perhaps more than that, a teacher. He could not see a flawed movement without wanting to correct it. That urge is not so different from my own. When I watch a farmer lift a sack, in a way that will ruin his back 2 winters from now. Habit makes tutors of us all, if we live long enough." At one point, Geralt misjudged a step. His boot slid on a wet patch where someone had spilled ale earlier. He recovered quickly, weight shifting, sword snapping up just in time to parry Holt's. For a heartbeat, their blades locked, faces close. Holt's eyes flickered with something like approval. "Good," he said. "Even your mistakes can be used if you know how to fall." The innkeep, who had been hovering near the doorway with a rag in his hand, finally dared to speak. "If you chip my floor," he said nervously, "I will have to charge extra." I told him that there was no extra coin left to give him, but I could show him a compress for his headache in the morning if he allowed the world to continue existing tonight. He grumbled, yet retreated to a safe distance. It is remarkable how often mild humour can bribe someone into tolerating what they cannot fully understand. When the practice ended, Holt and Geralt were breathing hard but evenly. Sweat darkened their collars. Their swords slid home with the soft finality of tools returned to their places. Geralt looked again at the open pages on the table. "He watched you like this," he said. "Saw everything." Then went away and told the world that this was proof of monstrosity. Holt nodded. He would say, perhaps, that he was only showing them a dangerous truth, I added, that he held up a mirror. And if people flinched, it was because they could not bear what they saw. Geralt shook his head slowly. "A mirror is honest," he said. "This is more like one of those fairground glasses that stretch and twist you. You can recognize yourself, but only just, and never in a way that lets you walk easily after." Outside, the rain began to soften. Inside, the inn felt smaller, crowded with the ghosts of a younger Holt, of Artemon with his ink-stained fingers, of all the people who had read these pages and decided that they knew what a witcher was. We still cannot help but wonder whether the worst betrayals come from enemies who strike from the shadows, or from friends who once knew the exact weight of our steps, and still chose to sketch us in lines that make us look like monsters. The rain had washed the world clean for a day, but mud is patient. By the time we left the leaning inn behind, the road was already chewing at our boots again. Light slipped between clouds and flashed on steel and leather. From a distance, we were only 3 figures and 2 horses, another forgettable procession on the long spine of the continent. The weeks that followed were not one grand adventure, but a string of smaller knots. Witchers live like that. A bard would skim past these days. I remember them clearly, because quiet work reveals a man more surely than any battle. The first knot waited in a village drowning in sunflowers. Doors were bolted, voices hushed. Children swore a spectre floated through the fields at dusk. An old man insisted his dead wife had called him from the far edge of the Yellow Sea. The elders, frightened, were ready to burn half their harvest rather than risk cursed oil on their tables. Geralt went alone into the fields at sunset. Fireflies rose from the ditches in glimmering clouds. The children followed at a distance, hiding behind fence posts, the way patients hide their fear behind polite smiles. When he came back, he carried 3 things: a torn white sheet snagged on a stake, a crude wooden skull on a string, a wineskin that smelled very strongly of cheap spirits. "Your ghost," he told the elder, "has more to do with the bottle than with the grave." The truth was small and ridiculous. 2 bored boys, an uncle who liked drink and drama, and the human habit of turning half-seen shapes into horrors. Once the first rumour spread, every rustle in the stalks became proof. "So there is no monster," the elder said, caught between relief and shame. "You have plenty," Geralt answered. "Hunger, taxes, one bad season away from real trouble if the weather turns. They simply lack teeth and glowing eyes, so no one sings about them." He took a few coins and a sack of flour. "I sold the uncle a bitter tisane for headaches and advised him to drink more water and fewer ghosts." The children walked with us to the last house, asking whether witches could see in total darkness. Geralt told them that only mothers listening for a child's cough truly see in the dark, then left them to puzzle over that while we moved on. Farther north, a keep had posted a notice for a ghoul problem in the burial pit beyond its walls. We found the creatures easily. Thin things, hides stretched tight, ribs sharp as cage bars. They had been feeding on villagers thrown nameless into a shallow trench after a fever swept through the hamlet. There were more crosses than one winter should bear. I watched Geralt work. His movements had changed since Rockamora. The raw slash of a young fighter had settled into the measured economy of a craftsman. He used ard once, exactly when the pack needed breaking, and never wasted breath on a shout. Holt stayed to one side, stepping in only when angles grew truly dangerous. Later, while we burned the remains, a steward rode out from the keep, nose wrinkled at the smoke. He asked whether witcher corruption would linger in the soil, quoting a line from Monstrum about mutated blood poisoning the earth. "What lingers here," I told him, "is neglect. No one sat at those bedsides with clean water. No one dug proper graves until the bodies piled too high. That carelessness breeds ghouls far more reliably than any potion in a witcher's veins." He did not like the answer, but he listened. There is a particular silence when a comfortable story is pried loose. It sounds a little like cloth tearing. In a market town to the south, we arrived too late. The council had argued for weeks about whether they truly needed a witcher or whether a few extra guards would suffice. By the time we came, drowners had grown bold enough to drag a trader from his wagon in daylight. Holt and Geralt cleared the nest in a cold scramble of mud and teeth. When we returned, the trader's family still waited by the road, eyes fixed on the space he should have filled. I cleaned the blood from Geralt's hands before the youngest child saw it. It was a small kindness against a loss that should never have happened. In my trade, we call such deaths preventable. It is a dry word for a heavy grief. Somewhere behind that delay, I could hear the book again, whispering that dealing with mutants was a last resort, that it was wiser to wait, to see, to hope. Between these darker tasks, gentler scenes stitched the days together. We shared a table with a wayhouse keeper whose curses about the mud could have stripped bark from trees, yet who slipped extra onions into our stew and pretended it was an accident. I showed a farm boy how to set his father's broken finger with a straight stick and a strip of cloth, while Holt and Geralt haggled in the yard. On a frosty morning, I listened to Geralt quietly correct a labourer's grip on an axe. "Hold it like that for long," he said, "and you will have my wrists by the time you are 50. The man laughed, tried the new grip, and looked honestly surprised when his shoulders thanked him. Care spreads quietly. So does suspicion. In one town, the innkeep greeted Geralt by name, though we had never been there. The story of the river beast in Neuhold had arrived first, polished and exaggerated. The man insisted that Geralt had slain 3 monsters at once and refused triple pay. Geralt let the lie stand. Correcting praise rarely earns you friends. In another village, a tinker asked if he was the white wolf who had dragged a child from a burning barn in some distant duchy. That tale clearly belonged to another witcher. Yet again, Geralt only shrugged. Stories borrow faces as they travel. A man either spends his life chasing them, or he accepts that his shadow will sometimes walk where he has never been. Meanwhile, the shadow of Monstrum grew thicker. I heard its phrases from mouths that had never touched ink. A miller in a roadside tavern declared that witches had no souls, and thus no reason to keep their word. A young scribe quoted a passage about innate moral decay when his master hesitated to pay full price. Holt listened, saying little. He let Geralt lead more often, allowed him to bargain for contracts, to decide which jobs smelled wrong, to walk away when a request sounded more like a lynching with extra steps than a hunt. Age had turned Holt from hunter to teacher without asking his consent. "You are making him into your answer," I told him one night, as Geralt sat a little apart with the red book on his knee, its ravens glimmering in firelight. "Better than leaving him to learn it all from Artemon," Holt said. I looked at them then, the older witcher whose time had begun to narrow, the younger whose name was already outrunning his footsteps. Between them lay Monstrum, a clever lie dressed in careful truths. Around us the dark pressed close, full of troubles that had nothing to do with ink and everything to do with hunger, cold and fear. We still cannot help but wonder whether a man's true shape is carved by what he does on muddy roads and in forgotten fields, or by the sharper silhouettes other people sketch of him on the clean pages of their books. In the end, it was not a grand revelation that set us on Artemon's trail, but a letter and a ledger. That is often how truth arrives, not with lightning, but with ink and numbers. We had stopped for the night in a wayhouse near the border, the sort of place built more as a compromise between distances than as a destination for anyone's dreams. The food was thin, the beds lumpy, but the roof kept the wind out as it worried at the shutters. The wayhouse keeper recognized me from a time I had lanced a boil on his neck years before. Gratitude, even for such unglamorous service, tends to last longer than people expect. In return, he set down a jug of his best ale and a folded packet of letters on the table. "These came for you," he said, "or for someone who knew you. A courier from the temple passed through last week and left them with instructions. The seal was Neneka's. Inside, her brief script told me that my inquiries about Artemon had stirred embers I had not realized were still warm. She had reached out to other houses and to a scholar she trusted in a city of scribes and parchment. The reply had come back swiftly enough to suggest that we were far from the first to ask where the author of Monstrum might be found. "Ascuth," she wrote, "a minor court, but ambitious. Artemon serves as advisor to a lord there, speaks often in the great hall as if he were its second voice. Copies of his book are being made in the city scriptoria under his supervision. If you wish to confront him, that is where the road leads." Holt read the letter twice, his finger following the lines slowly. His face did not change, but I saw the way his shoulders eased, as if an old bowstring had been tightened for so long that even the prospect of release felt unreal. So, he said quietly, he has traded fortress corridors for a cushioned chair beside a lord. That seems fitting. He always preferred the company of those who could applaud him. Geralt looked up from the ledger he had been studying. It belonged to the Wayhouse, and described who had passed through in the last month. Wagoners, pilgrims, a troop of mercenaries, a travelling monk with a crate of relics. Artemon's name does not appear there, Geralt said, but the monk carried a crate marked with the sigil of Ascuth. Holy trinkets and dangerous ideas travel together more often than one would think. A lord who surrounds himself with both is either very devout, very frightened, or very eager to keep the devout and the frightened in line. We turned our steps toward Ascuth. The landscape shifted as we went. Hills grew steeper, the soil more stony. Vineyards gave way to scrub and twisted pines, clinging to slopes like stubborn thoughts. The wind carried the faint tang of the sea even before we saw it, a taste of salt and distance. Holt walked more often than he rode now, claiming it eased his hips. I knew that excuse well. Men prefer to blame bones rather than admit that the rhythm of their thoughts needs the slow pace of feet on earth. Geralt teased him about it once, suggesting lightly that soon he would be asking for a walking stick. "If I do," Holt answered, "I will make sure the stick has a blade in it." Old age does not require surrender. On the road we saw Monstrum again, in a new form. A peddler came trundling toward us with a handcart piled high with pamphlets and small leather volumes. He had a voice that carried and a laugh that arrived just a shade too quickly after his own jokes. Spotting us, he brightened. "Travellers," he called, "have you heard the latest teachings from Master Artemon of Ascuth? Wisdom for the common man, bound in calfskin and priced for any honest purse." He hoisted a copy of Monstrum in one hand, waving it like a flag. Holt's jaw hardened. Geralt's fingers twitched near his sword, not in threat, but in an old reflex. I stepped forward first. "I have read that book," I said. "It is heavy with guilt dressed up as virtue." The peddler blinked, taken aback by the lack of awe. "Guilt," he said. "No, sir. It is a warning. It says what everyone has always suspected, that these mutants walk among us, dangerous, unstable." He glanced at Holt and Geralt then, as if realizing only belatedly what company he had stumbled into. His mouth struggled to decide between salesmanship and fear. "My friends here," I said, "are witches. You have just praised a book that calls for their exclusion from all decent company, yet you are content to share the road with them when it brings you profit." The peddler swallowed. "The words are not mine," he muttered. "I only sell the pages. People say they want to feel safer. And does this book make them safer?" I asked. "Or does it simply make it easier to ignore the rot on their own doorsteps?" He shifted from foot to foot. A sheep waiting for weather to choose its direction looks much the same. I told him then, not of drowners and ghouls, but of the boy whose ghost had been nothing but a trick and drink, of the fever pit where neglect fed monsters more surely than any curse. He listened, confused by the absence of grand horror. It is more comfortable to believe in claws and fangs than in the consequences of one's own omissions. In the end, he packed his cart and moved on. He did not burn his copies of Monstrum. People rarely abandon a livelihood in a single conversation. Yet he glanced back at us more often than he had before, and the hand that touched the book's spine did so with less reverence. On the third day, we saw Asguth. It rose from the cliffs above a narrow harbour, walls pale against the darker rock. The sea slammed itself against the base of the cliffs with the stubborn regularity of an old argument. Above, banners snapped in the wind. The sigil was unfamiliar to me, some beast, half lion, half bird. Lords love to imagine themselves strange and mighty. We entered through a gate that smelled of fish and tar. Sailors shouted along the quay, hauling ropes, haggling over crates. A scribe in ink-stained robes hurried past with a bundle of manuscripts pressed to his chest. As he brushed by, one loose booklet slipped and fell at Geralt's feet. He stooped to pick it up. The cover bore the now familiar ravens and title, though in cheaper ink. A pamphlet version, easily copied, easily thrown away, yet likely to travel farther than the fine red leather editions ever would. The scribe thanked him breathlessly and snatched it back. "Copies for the household staff," he explained. "The master wishes all under this roof to be properly instructed." The master, of course, was Artemon's patron, a lord who wanted his servants to see the world through the lens of his chosen adviser. It was a clever move. You do not need chains if you can bind people with stories. We found lodging in a small inn tucked beneath the shadow of the castle walls. Its owner did not ask many questions. That itself was a kind of answer. In towns where fear has been given official form, people learn that curiosity can be risky. Better to serve stew and close your ears. From our narrow window we could see the spire of a great hall and, beyond it, the low roofs of the scriptorium district. Scribes moved there, like ants, carrying stacks of parchment. Heads bent. Somewhere among those rooms sat Artemon, shaping his next set of words. Holt watched the walls as the light faded. Geralt leaned against the windowsill, arms folded, eyes following the patrol of guards along the ramparts. I sat with my back to the wall, listening to the muffled life of the inn. Plates clinked. Someone laughed too loudly. A child complained about the taste of cabbage. Tiny normalities, stacked up against the looming fact that within a stone's throw a man sat rewriting the world's understanding of witches and the work they did. We had walked a long way from the gallows at Rockamora. The faces in the crowds had changed, but the expressions were the same. Suspicion, relief, hunger, boredom, all braided together. Monstrum had not created those emotions. It had simply given them a script and a vocabulary. That is often the most dangerous thing an idea can do. We still cannot help but wonder whether a city like Asguth is built more on its stone foundations and harbour walls, or on the invisible scaffolding of tales and teachings that tell every soul within it who should be feared, who should be trusted, and who must never be allowed to speak for themselves. Asguth by daylight looked almost honest. The harbour shouted with the usual noise of commerce. Fishmongers cursed the weather, sailors cursed their luck. Carts creaked, gulls circled and screamed whenever a crate of offal was opened. The castle above it all rose from the cliff like a pale tooth. From the lower streets, the banners on its walls were just splashes of colour, not yet the symbols of the power that moved behind them. We began, as one always does in such places, with the gatekeepers, the clerks, the minor functionaries who believe they run the world because they hold a quill and the key to the next door. Holt kept his hood low, his medallion tucked away. Geralt did the same. Witches are more likely to be admitted to a lord's hall as curiosities or threats than as guests. This time we wanted none of those roles. I presented myself at the castle gate as what I was. Radko, physician licensed by temple and guild. I offered letters I had carried for years from houses I had served in Caedwen and beyond. Some seals had broken and been mended, but the ink still held the weight of noble names. The guard captain sent us to the steward. The steward sent us to a chamberlain whose sleeves were so tight they squeaked when he moved his arms. He examined the letters with the air of a man seeking a reason to refuse and finding none. The Lord of Asguth has a fondness for foreign expertise, he said at last. His joints complain of late, and his private leech has proved more skilled at draining purses than pain. You may present yourself tomorrow. Your companions will remain in the town. He glanced toward Holt and Geralt with polite distaste. They are my assistants, I said. The roads are not safe. I do not travel alone. The chamberlain hesitated. The castle had guards, of course, but even guards fall ill and break bones. A physician who felt slighted might prove slow to respond when called. He weighed those thoughts behind his narrow eyes, then waved a hand. Very well. They may accompany you as bearers of your instruments. There must be no swords in the Lord's presence. We agreed. Witches can make a room dangerous even without steel. That night, back in the cramped room under the castle wall, Holt unbuckled his sword and laid it on the table. Geralt did the same. For a moment the narrow space felt oddly empty, as if we had taken the teeth from a predator and expected it to behave like a house cat. You are certain about this? Geralt asked. If we walk in armed, Holt said, we will be treated as blades for hire, or as threats to be managed. I want him to see us as voices. At least, at first. You expect him to listen, I said. I expect him to try to make a sermon of us, Holt answered. That is his habit. But sermons sometimes crack when the subject stands in front of the pulpit. We slept poorly. The sea hummed under the cliffs, a constant low growl. I lay awake listening to it, and to the breathing of the two men sharing the room. Geralt's sleep was shallow, restless, the kind of half-rest that witches learn to live on. Holt's was punctuated by small catches in his breath, as if his lungs had grown used to being held on a short leash. I counted their breaths as I have counted many others, a habit that has never quite left me. Morning brought a grey light and a summons. A page in livery waited in the common room, twisting his cap in his hands as we came down. His gaze lingered on Holt with open curiosity, then darted to Geralt and away again, as if afraid that looking too long might draw bad luck. The Lord will receive the physician and his 2 attendants, he said. Inside, Asguth's castle was a different world from the fish, stench and tar outside. Stone floors, polished thin by generations of feet, tapestries showing hunts and battles, all antlers and banners and triumphant spears. Servants moved with the muffled efficiency of people who know the value of being overlooked. The air smelled of beeswax, roasted meat, and the faint sourness of too many people living too close together. They led us to the great hall first. Lords like to pretend all business begins before their carved chairs. The room was long, the the ceiling lost in shadow. At one end, on a raised platform, sat Lord Asgoth, a man in late middle years, with a belly that spoke of regular feasts and a face lined more by displeasure than by honest labour. To his right, at a lower seat, was a figure I recognized at once, though I had never seen him in the flesh. Artemon of Asgoth did not look like a villain from a tavern tale. He had no wild eyes, no cloak embroidered with skulls. He wore scholar's robes in good wool, his hair pulled back neatly, his hands clean and long-fingered. A silver chain lay at his throat, not a mage's amulet, merely an ornament to show he belonged near power. His eyes were the most unsettling part. Calm, bright, attentive. They slid over the hall and catalogued it in an instant. He saw the wolf medallions even before the herald finished announcing us. I watched his gaze pause on Holt, move on to Geralt, then return to the older witcher with a sharp little smile. "Preston Holt," he said softly, before the Lord could speak, "as I live and breathe." I had wondered whether you still did the same. His voice carried just enough to reach the nearest benches, yet somehow it filled the space. People at the lower tables turned to stare openly. Holt inclined his head. His face was as expressionless as the stone beneath our feet. "You seem to be thriving, Artemon," he said. "Your change of profession suits you." "I have not changed professions," Artemon replied. "I still serve truth. I have merely found a more attentive audience." Lord Asgoth shifted on his chair, clearly annoyed that his adviser had seized the opening. "Power is rarely as unified as it appears from a distance. You have questions about my work," the mage said, "or perhaps accusations. I have heard rumours of a witcher asking after me along the roads. I assumed it was you." He gestured lightly at the benches near the dais. "Sit, if you will. Let us not pretend this must be a duel." It was a clever move. To accept the seats was to look like supplicants. To refuse was to seem rude and dangerous. Holt chose a third path. He stepped forward just enough to stand in the open space before the dais, not at the foot of it, not at the top of the steps. Geralt stayed slightly behind his right shoulder. I remained off to the side, close enough to speak, far enough to appear unimportant. Physicians learn to wear invisibility like a cloak. "You know why I am here," Holt said. Artemon rested his fingertips together. "You believe Usopp Kaziv," he said, "that my book has wronged your kind, that by writing honestly about the trials and the consequences of mutations, I have made life more difficult for witchers." "Honesty," Holt repeated. "That is one word for it." Artemon's gaze sharpened. "You would prefer I had remained silent as you did," he said. "That I had kept the notes and figures in locked chests, whispers shared only between those directly involved." "You did not share the whole truth," Holt answered. "You chose the pieces that painted us as irredeemable monsters. You forgot to mention who paid for those trials, who ordered them, who demanded stronger, faster, more obedient killers to tidy up the mess their own wars made." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Words like killers and trials are not often spoken so boldly in front of a lord. Lord Asgoth raised a hand. "You will not turn my hall into a brawl of accusations," he said. "Master Artemon's work has been of great value here," He has opened our eyes to threats that move in the shadows. If your quarrel with him is personal, take it elsewhere." Holt did not take his eyes off Artemon. "It is personal," he said, "but not only mine." He stepped aside, just far enough that Geralt came fully into the Lord's line of sight. "This is Geralt," he said, "Witcher, contractor of your river problems if you ever manage to notice them in time. His life has been shaped by your book, Artemon, though you never met him. Tell him that your truth has served him well." For a moment, the great hall shrank to the space between the three men. Lord, mage, mutant. The rest of us were props and echoes. Artemon regarded Geralt with cool interest. "You have benefited from my work, in fact," he said. "Without it, people might have trusted you more freely, invited you closer to their hearths, let you mingle with their children. Dangerous mistakes. My warnings keep a healthy distance between your kind and those you were designed to protect." Geralt's jaw tightened. "Designed," he repeated, "like a tool." "Like a tool, yes," Artemon said. "A necessary one, perhaps, in a world as broken as ours. But one does not leave a loaded crossbow on a nursery floor." Lord Asguth nodded approvingly. The metaphor pleased him. "Here in Asguth," the mage continued, "my book has helped us craft clear rules. Witchers may enter the city for contracts, but must remain in assigned quarters. Payments are recorded and overseen. No lingering in taverns, no private dealings with impressionable minds." "In other words," Holt said, "you have given them cause to fear him first, and pay him only when desperation outweighs your sermons." Artemon's smile thinned. "Fear is not a thing I invented, Preston. It was here long before either of us, wrapped around your medallion like ivy. I merely articulated what people already felt. I had heard enough variations of that argument in sick rooms to recognize its shape. It is the same reasoning a negligent father uses when he claims his anger is only love spoken loudly. The same self-justification a lord utters when he raises taxes and calls it necessary for stability. You stand very far from the gallows at Rockamora," I said softly, before I could stop myself. Artemon's head turned toward me with slow curiosity, as if noticing a fly that had landed on his sleeve. "And you are?" he asked. "A physician," I answered. "I was there the day they almost hanged this young man simply for doing his work. Men in that crowd quoted your words while clutching stones." The mage's expression did not change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Calculation, perhaps. "If a town let fear turn to lawless violence," he said, "that is hardly my doing. My book calls for vigilance, not lynching." "Words are stubborn things," I replied. "They do not always stay in the pens you draw for them." The hall murmured again. Lord Asguth frowned, annoyed that his morning had turned into a philosophy debate. He liked his truths simple and his monsters clearly marked. "Enough," he said. "I will not have my adviser harassed in my own hall. Unless you can prove that Master Artemon has broken some law of mine, you will speak your piece quickly and leave." Holt's gaze flicked to the Lord, then back to Artemon. "Very well," he said. "I will speak quickly, tonight, somewhere without an audience that you can preach to. You and I, Artemon, and the boy whose life your words have tried to shape." "A private meeting," the mage said. He sounded amused. "Do you think me a fool?" "I think you have grown comfortable," Holt answered. Comfortable men make mistakes. They locked eyes across the space. Between them, I could feel the weight of all the dead boys on stone tables, all the printed copies of Monstrum, all the gallows ropes and pointed fingers those pages had justified. In the end, vanity won, as it so often does. Artemon rose. "Very well," he said. "Tonight, in the upper study of the scriptorium, after the bells of second dark, I will indulge your need for personal closure. Bring your witcher, and your physician, if you like." He seems determined to witness this. He looked at me with cold interest, as if measuring how much blood my satchel could contain. We bowed and were dismissed. The chamberlain fussed about protocol. The lord waved for more wine. The hall resumed its murmuring life. Yet as we walked back down the long aisle, I could feel eyes on our backs, heavy and curious. Outside, the air tasted of sea and ink. Scribes hurried past us carrying fresh stacks of parchment. One of them glanced at Geralt's medallion and paled, recalling no doubt some line about proximity and corruption. He gave the witcher a wide berth, yet could not resist staring. That is the nature of fear. It wants to be both far away and close enough to peer at safely. We returned to the inn and sat in the cramped room with the shutters half closed. Holt cleaned his sword that he was not yet allowed to wear inside the castle. Geralt checked the small knives he kept hidden where genteel eyes never thought to look. I counted bandages and tinctures, knowing that no amount of preparation can quite steady the hands when walking into a room where words and old sins will be unsheathed together. We still cannot help but wonder whether the longest nights are those spent fighting monsters of flesh and claw, or the ones where you walk toward a man who once called himself your friend, knowing that by dawn either his voice or yours may be gone from the world. The bells of second dark found us on the move. Ascooth's streets were almost empty, wind from the cliffs driving scraps of paper along the gutters. Only the castle and the scriptorium still showed light, one yellow square burning in the upper floor of the scribe's house. Holt set the pace, steady and unhurried. Geralt walked at his right shoulder, cloak hiding the medallion at his throat. I came after them with my satchel. The stair smelled of ink and dust. At the top, a door stood half open. Holt pushed it wider. The study was low-beamed, its walls drowned in shelves. Tables under the windows were strewn with parchment and bundles of red-bound volumes. A lamp on the central table cast a circle of light. Beyond it, the panes were black squares over the drop to the sea. Artemon sat at the lamp's edge. He looked up, as calm as a host greeting late guests. "Preston," he said, "you look older. Even altered blood cannot bribe time forever." Holt stopped across the table. Geralt stood a step behind. I stayed near the door. "You know why we are here," Holt said. Artemon inclined his head. "You wish to blame me for your misfortunes," he answered. "Rockamora, Neuhold, all the little towns whose councils read my work more carefully than you like." Geralt's voice was low. "They read your words with ropes in their hands," he said. "The noose in Rockamora might as well have been twisted from your pages." Artemon studied him. "You lived," he said. "That proves what I wrote. You are not like them. Your resilience frightens them. I have merely given their fear language." "Fear is a habit you have been feeding," I said. "You go from court to court teaching people how to hate with a clean conscience. He waved that aside. "You are a physician," he said. "You should understand that unpleasant truths save lives. Witches are dangerous. My book warns of that. Nothing more." Holt's knuckles whitened on the table edge. "You counted dead boys with me in the fortress," he said. "You knew who ordered the trials. Yet when you finally spoke, you pointed at us and told the world that we were the crime." Artemon's face hardened. "I pointed at the apparatus," he said. "Lords, priests, patrons, mutants, all of it obscene. Do not pretend your swords are clean. You have killed more people than any book ever will." "I kill things that crawl out of marshes to tear villages apart," Holt said. "You set villages against the men who stand in those marshes for them." "Rewrite it," Holt said. "Tell the part you cut away." Artemon actually laughed. "You want me to unmake my life's work to soothe your late conscience," he said. "Even if I wished to, it is impossible. The first copies are everywhere. Priests preach from them. Magistrates lean on them. They will not toss Monstrum into the fire because its author lost an argument in a study." "So you will change nothing," I said. "Nothing," he answered. "The world needs warnings more than it needs your comfort." Geralt stepped closer. "Then at least admit what your warnings have done," he said. "When a town panics and hangs a witcher who saved a child, your sentences are there, smoothing their sleep." Artemon's patience snapped. "Men have always needed excuses," he said. "If it were not my book, it would be some sermon or tavern tale. You give me too much credit." His right hand slid under the table. The air thickened at once. It felt as if a band had closed around my chest. Geralt swayed. Holt's fingers dug into the wood. "You will leave Asguth at first light," Artemon said. "You will not return. If you defy that, I will show this court how quickly your kind lose control. They already expect it. My work has ensured that." "You never stopped," Holt said to him. "All these years you have still been pressing to see what happens when you push too hard." Then he moved. He leaned across the table and seized Artemon's wrist. Light bit along the mage's arm. The smell of scorched cloth filled the air. Holt's hand shook, yet he did not let go. For a heartbeat, the pressure holding us up wavered between two wills. Geralt struck the table with his palm. Inkpots toppled. The lamp lurched, oil spilled. Flame ran in a thin line across parchment. The pattern Artemon held faltered. The band around my chest vanished so fast I had to clutch the doorframe. Artemon jerked backward. Holt's grip slipped. The heavy table skidded on oil and scattered papers. Its corner crashed into the nearest window. Glass boomed, then burst. Cold air and spray flew in. For one moment, Artemon hung near the jagged frame, robe flapping, fingers clawing at nothing. Then he was gone. The sea took him with a sound like a door slammed below us. We put the fire out with boots and cloth before it could reach the shelves. Ink spread across the boards in dark pools. Holt's wrist was burned from thumb to elbow. He watched me bind it without a sound. The guards arrived with the chamberlain on their heels. They stopped at the broken window and the empty space where their mage should have been. "What happened?" he whispered. Geralt answered in the same tone he used to state a contract. "He attacked us," he said, "tried to crush the air from our lungs with some art of his. The room broke under it. The table hit the window." The chamberlain's eyes went from Holt's wrist to the scattered books. to the glass on the floor. "Seal this room," he said at last. "No one enters until Lord Asgoth has seen it. You will remain at the inn until he decides what to call this." We walked back between spears. People peered from doorways. Word had already run ahead. I heard scraps as we passed. The mage fell. The witches threw him. The gods dragged him down. Each tongue took the same bones and dressed them differently. That night the sea sounded louder. I lay awake between two breathing shadows and listened to the waves grind at the foot of the cliffs. Somewhere down there, rock and water were working Artemon into something shapeless. Above, his books lay dry and safe on shelves, words untouched. We still cannot help but wonder whether the man who wrote them truly ended in that sudden dark beyond the window, or whether the sharpest part of him survives in every copy opened by hands eager to find a polished reason to fear the very people who keep the real monsters from their doors. Morning came thin and colourless over Asgoth. The castle bells tolled with a subdued note, as if the metal itself knew something in the tower above the sea had cracked. In the streets, people moved quietly. When a court mage vanishes in the night, even those who disliked him lower their voices. We were summoned to the hall before the first meal. The same long room, the same tapestries of hunts and victories glaring from the walls. Lord Asgoth sat heavier on his chair, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. On a stand beside him lay a single red-bound copy of Monstrum, silk marker still tucked deep among its pages. We stood where we had stood before, Holt in front, Geralt at his shoulder, myself a little to the side. Guards lined the walls. Their hands rested on spear shafts with the tension of men who have been told that something terrible might happen and are desperate not to be the ones found unready. The Chamberlain spoke first, voice thin. "Master Artemon fell from the scriptorium window," he said. "There is no body. The sea below is unforgiving." Lord Asgoth's gaze skewered us one by one. "He met with you," he said, "at his own suggestion." "Why?" Holt's voice was steady. "We came to ask that he correct certain parts of his work," he said. "That he speak more plainly of who ordered the trials and who profits when witches are treated as tools and little more." He did not care to hear it. "You accuse my adviser of falsehood in my own hall," the Lord said. "I accuse him of half-truths," Holt answered. "Sometimes those are worse." The Lord's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. "He says you attacked him," the Chamberlain put in quickly. The room went very still. Holt looked at him. "Did you hear him say that?" he asked. The Chamberlain's mouth opened and closed. No one answered. A living mage might defend himself with words. "A dead one speaks only through the stories others choose to tell." Geralt stepped forward. "He tried to crush us with his art," he said. "I felt it." Radko could not breathe. "Preston's wrist is burned where he grabbed the man's casting arm." The table slipped in the spilled oil, struck the window. The glass gave way. "You could have pulled him back," someone muttered from the benches. Geralt's eyes were tired. "We were trying not to die," he said. "It leaves little spare strength for rescuing those who push you into a wall." I watched the faces along the hall. Doubt, sympathy, resentment. Many of them had liked having a court mage. It made them feel significant. as if their little cliff fortress mattered more because a famous man sat within it. Others had feared him quietly, and now felt a guilty lift in their chests at the thought that he was gone. All of them would have to choose which story to tell when they went home. Lord Asguth tapped the book at his elbow. "This work," he said, "has brought order to my lands. It has taught my people caution. Are you asking me to outlaw it because its author was careless near a window? We are asking you," I said, "to remember that it is only one man's view, and that the men it describes are standing before you, able to speak for themselves. The Lord studied us with a look trained by years of weighing grain and taxes. Whatever happened in that study last night," he said finally, "I cannot afford a scandal. Other courts watch this one. If word spreads that my mage died at Witcher hands, contracts will wither. Allies will suspect me of losing control. So," Geralt said quietly, "how will you tell it?" Lord Asguth's gaze drifted to the high windows, where a line of sea light shivered. "Artemon fell while working late," he said. "There was an accident with the lamp. The table slipped. The glass gave way. Those present tried to save him and failed. It was not the truth. It was not entirely a lie. Most stories that endure sit somewhere between." "And us?" Holt asked. "You will leave Asguth before sundown," the Lord answered. "You will not return." His voice hardened. "Your kind will still be admitted here for contracts. The sea and the hills do not care how my mage died. They will send monsters regardless. But you will work under the rules he set. You will stay in assigned quarters, take only approved jobs, speak to no one about what happened here. So even dead, Artemon still writes the terms," Holt said. The Lord's mouth twitched. "Dead or not, his book lies on every reading stand from here to the border," he said. "I cannot pull it back any more than you can unsheathe a sword stroke once it has left your arm." He raised one hand. "Go. Take your lives and your grudges with you. I will not hang the men who keep my roads clear. But I will not let you preach your own version of the world here." We turned and left. No chains, no ropes, just the soft hiss of whispers following us out of the hall. In the courtyard, the wind smelled of salt and ink and something faintly burnt. We crossed the cobbles in silence. At the gate, the captain who had first examined our papers looked away as we passed. Whether from shame or simple discomfort, I could not say. On the harbour road, Holt paused. He looked back once at the tower where the study window gaped dark above the sea. Perhaps he saw again the younger man with ink-stained fingers. The marginal note returned unanswered, the long years between. Perhaps he saw only rock and empty air. "It changes nothing," he said. "It changes at least one thing," I answered. "He will write no more." Holt's jaw tightened. "His words are already seeds in too many heads," he said. "Killing the gardener does not unplant the field." We walked away from Asguth. The path wound along the cliffs for a time before turning inland. The sea faded to a dull roar behind us. In a small hollow sheltered from the wind, we stopped to rest. Geralt sat on a rock, elbows on his knees. "Did we do what we came to do?" he asked. Holt considered this for a long moment. "I faced him," he said at last. "I told him what his work had become. He refused to hear it. That is an ending of a sort." "And you, Radko?" Geralt asked. I thought of gallows and marshes, river banks and temple cloisters. I thought of a boy's bruised throat in Rockamora, and the dried ink in the margin of a book I had opened on a winter night far from here. I wanted to see whether a man who writes such pages looks like a monster, I said. He did not. He looked like a man very skilled at comforting himself. Perhaps that is all a monster truly is. Holt smiled, but it was a tired thing. You still believe in scales and balances, he said. I believe in witnesses, I answered. Stories will be told about him in every hall from here to Caedwen. Let this be one version among them. We travelled together a little farther. We finished the contracts that waited in our satchels or on notice boards along the way. One more ghoul nest here, a nest of rats swollen by magic there. Nothing that would make a bard pause over his wine. At a crossroads marked by 3 weathered stones and a half-collapsed shrine, Holt stopped. Ravens hopped along the top of the tallest stone, watching us with their bright old eyes. "This is where I turn aside," he said. "There are still beasts enough in these hills for an old witcher to occupy what time remains. You two move faster without me." His wrist had healed into a stiff, shiny band of scar. Nenneker's draughts and my salves had done what they could. The deeper weariness in his bones could not be bandaged. "You could come back to the temple," I said. He shook his head. "Not yet," he answered. "Maybe when the weight in my chest is something other than Artemon's shadow." He clasped Geralt's arm once, hard. "You have seen now what books can do," he said. "Remember that when you accept or refuse a contract, some men will hire you to slay a beast. Others will try to pay you to confirm the fear they have been fed." Geralt nodded. "And if I am asked what witches are," he said, "tell them the truth that suits you," Holt replied. "Just remember that someone else will always be writing beside you." He turned then and walked down the lesser road. Cloak snapping in the wind, figure shrinking slowly between the hedges. The ravens on the stone watched him go. One feather drifted down, twisting lazily before it landed at our feet. Geralt and I moved on. In time, our paths parted too. He went where contracts called him, to swamps and courts and wars. I returned to my rounds between villages and temples, to broken bones and bad lungs, to births that spilled new life into rooms too small for hope, and deaths that came quietly at the end of long, worn-out days. Years later, in that winter infirmary, I opened Monstrum again and saw my own life folded between its lines. Not because I was named there. I was never important enough for that. But because I had stood at so many of the points where its ink met flesh. At the gallows in Rockamora, in the marsh village where drowners tested the strength of a witcher's ribs, in Neuhold's river stench, and in Nenneker's sun-washed courtyard. In a study above the sea where a man who believed he served truth chose to fall with his certainty clutched tight. Now I sit with the book in front of me and another in my hands. The one you are hearing. I cannot burn his words from the world. I can only set mine beside them, small and imperfect, offered not as scripture, but as testimony. If you have listened this far, you have walked with me from the crossroads of ravens to the edge of a cliff and back to this quiet room. You have seen witches kill and be nearly killed, save lives and be nearly hanged for it. You have heard a clever man defend his fear as honesty, and an old one admit that he stayed silent too long. I do not ask you to choose a side, as if life were as simple as banners in a hall. I ask you only this. The next time you hear someone speak of monsters, or see a book waved in the air like a weapon, pause for a moment. Remember that behind every neat sentence there is a tangle of days and faces and choices that no ink can fully hold. Remember that a witcher is not only a blade and a medallion, but a man walking home through mud after doing work no one else wanted. And perhaps, when you reach your own crossroads, with ravens watching from whatever bare branches stand nearby, you will weigh the stories laid before you a little more carefully before you let them tell you whom to fear. We still cannot help but wonder whether the truest measure of a life is what is written about it, or what is quietly faced and done when no one is taking notes. I leave that question with you now, as the candle burns low and the pages grow heavy.